The story of the von der Linde gang is an American tragedy on horseback, a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of a found family riding straight into the path of a world that no longer has room for them. From the 1870s to the early 1900s, their rise and fall runs alongside the death of the frontier and the birth of a colder, more ordered nation. The world was changing. Railroads carved steel lines through open plains, telegraphs stitched distant towns together, and government agents followed in their wake with ledgers, laws, and guns. The old ways were dying, not in an instant, but through 1,000 small compromises as civilization pressed in on every side. In this shifting landscape, one gang of outlaws became the living embodiment of the struggle between freedom and control. The von der Linde gang began as more than criminals. From its humble beginnings with two young conmen, Dutch von der Linde and Hosea Matthews, it was a philosophy on horseback, a roaming protest against a system they believed was rigged against the poor and the powerless. They robbed banks and trains, yes, but claimed to spare the needy, wrapping blood and gunpowder in speeches about liberty and dignity. In the truest sense, it was meant to be a family built on choice rather than blood. Into this wandering family came the lost soul who would become Dutch's first true son, Arthur Morgan, taken in as a teenager after losing his parents. Later came John Marston, another stray given a gun, a horse, and a place at the fire. Around them gathered misfits and runaways, Bill Williamson, Javier Escuela, Charles Smith, Sadie Adler, each drawn to the promise of belonging and the illusion of a life beyond the reach of governments and corporations. But how long can an idealistic dream survive when every score demands another compromise? At the center stand five figures, each carrying a different side of this conflict. Dutch, the charismatic prophet of freedom whose philosophy slowly twists into paranoia. Hosea, the weary strategist who sees the tide turning before anyone else. Arthur, the loyal enforcer learning too late what that loyalty has truly cost. John, the reluctant outlaw trying to trade bloodshed for a quiet life on a ranch. And Jack, the child born into the gang's shadow, who will inherit the final, bitter consequences. This is their complete story, told as one continuous saga. From Dutch and Hosea's first meeting, when two men tried to rob each other and instead found a partner, to the unseen disaster at Blackwater that shatters their confidence. From Arthur's last ride through a dying West to John's final stand at a lonely farmhouse, and the day a boy picks up his father's gun and ends the story for good. Every camp, every betrayal, every last word is part of a single American epic. The story begins, not with a gunfight, but with two drifters sharing a plan. Every plan has a promise, and this is the promise of this story. A single, continuous chronological journey through the entire von der Linde saga, stitched together from its humble beginnings in the 1870s to its final echoes in the early 1900s. Not two separate games, not two disconnected tragedies, but one unbroken line of cause and consequence, where every decision in Red Dead Redemption 2 bleeds directly into the world of Red Dead Redemption. This will be a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of family forged in fire and torn apart by progress. From the first spark between Dutch von der Linde and Hosea Matthews, through the recruitment of a teenage Arthur Morgan and a runaway John Marston, the gang's history will unfold in order, so that each campfire conversation, each robbery, each death lands with the weight of everything that came before it. The path is clear. First, the origins and ideals. Dutch and Hosea as rival conmen on a changing frontier, testing each other, then realizing they share the same hunger for freedom and the same hatred of a government that marches under the banner of civilization while crushing those who do not fit. Their early robberies will show a philosophy in the truest sense, a belief that stealing from the rich and corrupt can be an act of justice, and that an outlaw band can be both family and revolution. From there, the gang's golden years will take shape. Arthur becoming Dutch's right hand, John growing into a reckless younger brother, misfits and drifters gathering around the camp as the living embodiment of a dream that promises belonging to every lost soul. But even in those bright days, shadows will be there. Annabelle's death at the hands of Colm O'Driscoll, the feud that follows, the first hints that Dutch's ideals bend whenever his pride is wounded. How long can a man preach freedom while tightening his grip on everyone around him? Then comes the slow decay. The Blackwater ferry job that goes horribly wrong, the flight through Coulter, Horseshoe Overlook, Clemens Point, Shady Belle, and finally Beaver Hollow, each move marking a step down the ladder from hope to desperation. Dutch's plans grow grander and more reckless. Pinkertons close in, internal betrayals fester, and Arthur's faith begins to crack as illness forces him to see the world as it really is, rather than how Dutch insists it ought to be. The final act will bind this directly into Red Dead Redemption, John's attempt to build a quiet life at Beecher's Hope, the government's cold demand that he hunt his former family, Dutch's last stand on a cliff, and the day Jack Marston ends the cycle with a single gunshot. From Dutch and Hosea's first lie to Jack's final truth, it will all unfold as one continuous chain. And it all starts far from a battlefield. Not with a gunfight, not with a train exploding into splinters, but with something almost disarming. Two strangers on a dusty road, each trying to rob the other, and realizing that together they might just be able to rob the whole world. The story begins with a joke at gunpoint. Two men on a quiet road, each certain he has found an easy mark, each rehearsing the same lines about hard times and easy money. This is the very beginning of the von der Linde gang, and it unfolds not with bullets, but with the slow realization that the predator and the prey are staring into a mirror. Dutch von der Linde is younger, but already the living embodiment of his own philosophy. He dresses well for an outlaw, speaks with the cadence of someone who has read books and remembers every line that ever moved him. In his mind, this is a story of freedom and justice, of taking from the rich who built their fortunes on other people's backs. Hosea Matthews, older and quieter, walks into the same scheme from the opposite direction. A con man who studies faces more than he studies speeches, seeing what people want to hear and giving it to them. Each believes he has chosen the perfect victim, a wealthy man, traveling with too much cash and too little protection. Dutch approaches with charm, Hosea with a practiced stumble and a plea, and then the curtain tears. The carriage they intend to rob is empty. The real score is nowhere in sight. The only real danger is standing 3 feet away, holding a gun, wearing the same expression of dawning confusion. For a heartbeat, it could end in blood. 2 pistols, 2 egos, 2 futures hanging in the balance. But instead of the crack of gunfire, there is something stranger on that lonely road. Laughter. Dutch laughs first, loud and theatrical, acknowledging the absurdity. Hosea follows, a dry, knowing chuckle that says he has seen the world play crueler tricks than this. In that shared laugh, tension dissolves into respect. Who else could have fooled Dutch but someone as clever as Hosea? Who else could have read Hosea so cleanly but a man who refuses to be ordinary? From its humble beginnings as a failed robbery, a partnership forms. Dutch talks about the world that is coming, how the world was changing and the old ways were dying, how civilization is just a prettier form of robbery. Hosea listens, measuring the distance between idealistic rhetoric and practical survival, and then offers something Dutch badly needs, a plan that actually works. Their first shared con is simple, elegant, and intoxicating. Dutch provides the performance, distracting their mark with grand speeches about investment and opportunity. Hosea quietly lifts the purse, papers, and jewelry, moving through the room as if he belongs there. When it is over, when the money is counted and the danger is past, both men feel it. This is more than profit. This is possibility. In that moment, the idea of an outlaw family takes root. Not just a gang, but a refuge for every lost soul who cannot fit into the narrow lines of civilization. Dutch imagines a community bound by loyalty and shared dreams. Hosea imagines keeping that dream tethered to reality. Together, they believe they can rob the whole world and still sleep at night. Yet in that same laughter, in that same trust, something darker waits. What happens when Dutch's speeches drift too far from Hosea's quiet truths? What happens when the man who once laughed at a failed robbery starts believing his own legend more than his oldest friend? Those questions will not be answered on that road, but every betrayal, every fracture, every final argument in a burning campfire glow can be traced back to this first decision: to lower their guns, to share a joke, and to build a dream that one day will demand a terrible price. From that first shared joke on a dusty road, the partnership became a pattern, and then the pattern became a way of life. Dutch and Hosea moved across the frontier as a two-man show, drifting from town to town, from riverboats to rail depots, chasing opportunity and outrunning consequence. In the very beginning, their crimes were almost intimate. A rigged card game in a smoky saloon, where a pompous railroad investor left lighter in wallet and heavier in humiliation. A staged coach accident on a lonely trail, where a blustering banker rushed in to help and left without his lockbox. They picked their marks with care. The rich, the powerful, the visibly corrupt. Men who threw their weight around in a world where the old ways were dying. To them, this was not just theft. It was a story of balance being restored. On long rides between scores, Dutch's philosophy began to harden into something more than a convenient excuse. He would talk for hours about government tyranny, about politicians selling land they had never seen to railroads and oil barons, about civilization marching west under banners of law and progress while quietly stealing everything that made freedom possible. Why should ordinary people not take back what had been taken from them? Why should an outlaw be condemned while a robber baron was celebrated? Hosea listened, argued, and trimmed the edges. Where Dutch saw speeches and shootouts, Hosea saw risk and consequence. He pushed for cons over bloodshed, for cleverness over chaos. A forged deed could move a rancher off stolen land without a single gunshot. A fake land scheme could empty a magnate's pockets while leaving him too embarrassed to call the law. Hosea became the moderating force, quietly nudging Dutch away from cruelty, insisting that they could be outlaws with a code, in the truest sense, criminals who still believed in something. From its humble beginnings as a duo, a small crowd began to gather around them. Drifters who had nowhere to go, runaways fleeing brutal homes, former laborers broken by railroad foremen, or small-time thieves too clumsy to survive alone. Dutch's rhetoric promised freedom and family. Hosea's competence proved the promise was not just wind. Campfires turned into councils. Jobs turned into shared ventures. The first rough version of the Linde gang emerged long before names like Arthur Morgan or John Marston were ever spoken. For a time, it worked. Idealism and pragmatism, freedom and survival, dream and reality held each other in a fragile balance. But how long can a philosophy live in the mouths of outlaws before it bends to convenience? How long can a found family stay pure when every new member brings another lost soul, another burden, another temptation? That question would stop being theoretical the moment they took in their first true son. With Arthur Morgan, the dream of family became real, and the contradictions at the heart of Dutch's world would begin to grow teeth. With Arthur, Dutch finally had proof that his gospel could shape a life from the very beginning. A scared teenager became a devoted lieutenant, and in that transformation, Dutch saw confirmation that his philosophy was not just talk, but destiny. Dutch's creed was simple on the surface and intoxicating in practice. Government, to him, was not a protector, but a parasite, a distant machine run by cowards and liars. Civilization was a cage, built from laws, factories, and railroads that crushed the human spirit in the name of order. True freedom, Dutch insisted, could only exist outside that cage, among outlaws who chose each other, not neighbors and rulers imposed by birth or decree. In the truest sense, the gang was meant to be a story of self-determination. From its humble beginnings, every robbery became an act of revenge against a rigged world. When Dutch and Hosea robbed a train or a stagecoach, they did not call it theft. They called it taking back what had been stolen from the poor. Banks were instruments of oppression, rich men were leeches, and the money in their safes was framed as reparations for nameless farmers, laborers, and drifters crushed under debt. Violence, when it came, was never murder. It was necessary resistance, a tragic but noble stand against those who would see the old ways were dying and cheer. That was the genius of Dutch's rhetoric. Every bloody choice was wrapped in philosophy. Every body left on a dusty road folded into a grand narrative. Failures became setbacks, betrayals became tests of loyalty, and even the most chaotic shootout could be rewritten as part of a long, inevitable march toward freedom. Who would not want to believe that their crimes were part of a higher cause rather than simple greed? Yet from the start, there were cracks in this idealistic vision. Dutch loved the idea of the poor and oppressed, but often did not truly know them. He spoke for ranch hands, native tribes, and black freedmen more than he listened to them, projecting his own grievances onto their lives. His hatred of control, of anyone telling him no, masked a deep need to control everyone in his orbit. The man who cursed the state for owning people's lives demanded absolute loyalty from his own family. The Linde gang became both refuge and experiment, the living embodiment of Dutch's imagined world. Race, background, and class were supposedly washed away at the campfire. An ex-slave like Lenny, a native warrior like Charles, a former housemaid like Abigail could stand beside a disowned rich girl like Mary Beth, equal in theory so long as they believed. The price of belonging was not bloodline but faith, and that faith would be tested. The same speeches that once inspired Arthur and John, that made them feel part of something larger than themselves, would be repeated again and again as the years passed. Each time they rang a little hollower, as Dutch's plans grew riskier, as paranoia and selfishness replaced clarity and purpose. His gospel of freedom became a shield for his own fear. The world was changing, and Dutch would rather twist his philosophy than admit it. The tragedy of the gang's fall begins the moment his words stop matching his actions, and the sons he raised start to notice. For all Dutch's speeches, for all his grand declarations about freedom and civilization, the quiet spine of the gang's world was Hosea Matthews. If Dutch was the preacher, Hosea was the engineer, quietly making sure the train did not fly off the tracks. From the very beginning, he was the one turning big words into workable plans. Hosea was, in the truest sense, the gang's architect. Less theatrical than Dutch, rarely the loudest voice by the fire, yet almost every serious job ran through his mind first. He picked the targets, weighed the risks, read the room. When Dutch dreamed of robbing a train, Hosea asked who owned it, how many guards, what the Pinkertons would do next. He was the man who could walk into a town, chat with a bartender, and walk out knowing which banker cheated his clients and which sheriff could be bribed. His philosophy of crime was almost mercantile. To Hosea, being an outlaw was a trade, not a crusade. Violence was bad business. Every dead civilian meant more heat. Every flashy massacre meant more posters on the wall. He understood that every big score carried a cost Dutch preferred to ignore: dead partners, grieving families, a trail of witnesses who would never forget the gang's faces. Dutch saw a story of rebellion, Hosea saw a ledger of consequences. That pragmatism made him the living embodiment of the gang's better angels. When possible, he pushed for cons and swindles rather than shootouts, selling fake bonds, tricking wealthy marks, staging elaborate deceptions that left the victims embarrassed rather than bleeding. In St. Denis, his delight in the art of the scam showed a man who still believed brains could win out over bullets. Around the camp, he was a surrogate father, especially to Arthur. Dutch filled Arthur's head with ideals. Hosea taught him how to skin a deer, patch a wound, and recognize when a man was lying through his teeth. How many times did that quiet guidance keep some lost soul from dying in a ditch? Yet beneath that harmony, tension simmered. Dutch wanted bigger scores, bigger gestures, bigger proof that his philosophy meant something in a world that kept closing in. Hosea argued for smaller, safer jobs, for knowing when to walk away, for accepting that the old ways were dying and the gang could not outrun civilization forever. Their debates, half friendly and half ferocious, were the gang in miniature, idealistic dreams colliding with cold reality. Were they really helping the poor, or just justifying their own greed? As long as Hosea stood beside Dutch, the dream had guardrails. He could talk Dutch down from suicide missions, steer the camp away from open war, remind everyone that survival mattered more than spectacle. But guardrails only work while they hold. And the day those guardrails are ripped away, when Dutch is left alone with his rhetoric and his fears, the entire story of the van der Linde gang will tilt from dangerous to truly catastrophic. For a while, those guardrails hold, and what grows around Dutch and Hosea is more than a crew of robbers. It is a village on the move, a fragile utopia in miniature, drifting from valley to valley ahead of civilization. From its humble beginnings, every camp the van der Linde gang raises is arranged as though it might last forever. Tents form rough streets, wagons become storefronts, and a central fire turns cold wilderness into a shared home. There are chores and rotations, shared meals and coffee at dawn, music and storytelling at night. Pearson curses over the stew, Reverend Swanson mumbles half-remembered sermons, and even the most hardened gunslinger hauls water or chops wood. In the truest sense, everyone has a place. Everyone has a role. Dutch understands that guns and gold are not enough to hold this wandering world together. Words are his real weapon. Around that fire, he does not speak of men and followers. He speaks of we, of family, of our way, against their world. A robbery is not just a crime. It is a stand against the people who would cage them. A new recruit is not just another outlaw. They are a brother or sister welcomed home. How does someone walk away from that without feeling that it is a kind of betrayal? The faces around those fires tell a story of the America the history books forget. Charles Smith, of mixed native and African heritage, a quiet warrior who never truly belonged anywhere before. Lenny Summers, a brilliant black student turned outlaw after racist violence shattered his life. Javier Escuela, the revolutionary fugitive. Sadie Adler, a widow reborn as a gunfighter. Even Uncle, the perpetually lazy hanger-on, drifts in as another lost soul who somehow fits. Different races, different pasts, different traumas, all bound under Dutch's banner. For a time, the gang becomes the living embodiment of an alternative America, one that promises freedom to those civilization has cast aside. Yet, it is not anarchy. Inside the circle of wagons, there is a code. Do not harm innocents if it can be helped. Share the spoils so no one starves. Protect the women and children. Stand together when the world closes in, and above all, keep loyalty to the gang above loyalty to any law, nation, or distant dream. It is a philosophy half practical, half romantic. enforced by Susan Grimshaw's iron stare as much as Dutch's speeches. Break it, and exile, or worse, waits. But here the pattern interrupts. For all its warmth, this family depends on two men staying in step. Dutch provides the dream. Hosea provides the limits. What happens when the dream outgrows the limits? The utopia is real in the laughter, in the shared hardships, in the way Arthur and John raise their children in the shadow of the campfire. Yet the world was changing, the old ways were dying, and the Pinkertons, the railroads, and the banks are not bound by Dutch's code. As that pressure mounts, the village on the move will discover just how fragile its foundations truly are. Yet for all its talk of community, the moving village still needed a center. It needed someone who could turn Dutch's speeches and Hosea's plans into hard, bloody reality. That role did not fall to Dutch himself, or to Hosea, or even to John. It fell to a boy who had grown up learning that the world only respected the barrel of a gun. Arthur Morgan's story is, in the truest sense, a story of how an outlaw becomes a believer. From its humble beginnings, it is rooted in pain. His father, Lyle Morgan, was a petty criminal who drifted from one bad job to the next, dragging his son through saloons, back alleys, and cheap rented rooms. Arthur watched arrests, beatings, and hunger become ordinary. When Lyle was finally taken away in irons, the message was clear. The poor were expendable, and civilization had no patience for men who fell through the cracks. By his early teens, Arthur was already living the life that would have killed him. He stole horses, lifted wallets, and ran errands for men far more dangerous than he understood. Angry, directionless, and convinced that freedom meant never answering to anyone, he was on a straight path to a short stretch of prison, followed by an even shorter grave. Then, on some forgotten road, Dutch van der Linde and Hosea Matthews crossed his path and saw more than a half-starved thief. Two veteran con men, meeting a boy who would have robbed them if he could, recognized a reflection of their own pasts. Dutch saw potential. Hosea saw a lost soul. They took Arthur in, not as hired help, but as something closer to a son. Dutch filled his head with the philosophy that the government was rotten, that the rich were parasites, that real freedom could only be found outside the laws of a corrupt world. Hosea balanced that fire with cold instruction, teaching Arthur to hunt, to shoot straight, to track a man through snow or sand, and to read a stranger's eyes faster than a stranger's words. Under this dual mentorship, Arthur became the living embodiment of Dutch's ideals. Fiercely loyal, willing to ride into gunfire for the gang, he accepted that terrible acts could be justified if they protected the family. Robbing a train was not simple theft in his mind. It was a blow against the railroads that carved up the land. Holding a town at gunpoint was not cruelty. It was survival in a rigged game. Dutch pointed to Arthur as proof that his dream worked. Here was the orphaned boy he had saved, the man who owed everything to the gang's protection and purpose, yet that bond carried its own quiet danger. Because Arthur was Dutch's greatest success, Dutch clung to him as a symbol, even as the world was changing and the old ways were dying. And when the dream began to crack under Pinkerton pressure, bad decisions, and internal betrayal, Arthur would be the first to feel the distance between what Dutch preached and what Dutch actually did. The tragedy is that the man most devoted to the philosophy would also become the one who could no longer ignore its failures. The question is not whether Arthur loves his family. It is what happens when that love collides with the truth about the man who raised him. For Arthur, that collision does not begin with a gunshot or a betrayal. It begins with evenings by the fire, with Dutch's voice in his ear and Hosea's hand on his shoulder. From its humble beginnings, the van der Linde gang is not just a band of outlaws. It is a classroom, a church, and a family, all competing for the soul of a teenage boy who has nowhere else to go. Dutch shapes the myth. He sits Arthur down with dog-eared books, pushing philosophy he barely understands but absolutely believes. He reads him passages about freedom, about the individual standing against civilization, about how the world was changing and crushing anyone who refuses to kneel. Every robbery becomes a lesson. They are not stealing, they are striking back. A train job is a blow against corporate greed, a bank heist a protest against a rigged system. In Dutch's telling, Arthur is not a thug. He is a soldier in a noble war. Hosea shapes the reality. Where Dutch speaks in speeches, Hosea teaches in silences. He shows Arthur how to spot an ambush by the way birds scatter, how to read wagon tracks, how to tell when a mark is too desperate or too stupid to be worth the trouble. He is the one who says, "Walk away," when Dutch's eyes start to shine too bright. He explains that the smartest move is often not to pull the trigger at all. To Hosea, survival is a philosophy in the truest sense. live long enough to enjoy the spoils, and never kill for pride. Arthur grows up between these two fathers. He becomes Dutch's enforcer and Hosea's student, the living embodiment of their contradictions. He can ride down a stagecoach with terrifying, brutal efficiency, then sit quietly by the river sketching, wondering what all this blood is really buying. Is it freedom, or just another camp in another forest? He believes in Dutch's grand dreams, yet he trusts Hosea's quiet doubts. That tension becomes the center of his story. In those early years, Arthur's faith is almost absolute. Dutch rescued a lost soul and gave him a name, a purpose, a family. The gang is his world. He believes Dutch loves him as a son, believes Hosea is the wise uncle who will always be there to pull Dutch back from the edge, believes that if he just does what is asked, one more score, one more risk, the promised better life waits just over the horizon. But horizons keep moving. The old ways were dying, and Dutch's ideals would soon be tested against a world that refused to play along. The stronger Arthur's faith grows, the higher Dutch's pedestal rises. And when actions begin to drift away from words, when the noble war starts to resemble plain banditry, the fall from that height will not just crack Arthur's loyalty, it will shatter the very story he has told himself since the very beginning. The question becomes simple and devastating. What happens when a son realizes his father's revolution may have turned into a delusion? For Arthur, the crisis begins with a question. For John Marston, the question has been there from the very beginning. John's story is a story of absence before it is a story of guns and glory. Born to a petty outlaw father who drank away most chances at decency and a mother who died when he was still a boy, John is handed over to an orphanage that speaks of charity but runs on cruelty. The children are not wards, they are workers. They clean, they haul, they labor in fields and kitchens while the caretakers pocket donations and preach virtue. Beatings replace comfort. Hunger replaces warmth. No one comes back for him. In that cramped, airless world, John learns two lessons early. Adults lie, and institutions exist to use the weak. When he finally runs, it is not an act of rebellion against civilization in the grand sense Dutch loves to invoke. It is a child's desperate escape from a prison that pretends to be home. He steps out into a world that does not know his name, does not care if he lives or dies, and for the first time, his survival belongs only to him. The road that follows is brutal. John steals bread and clothes, then money and horses, graduating from petty theft to armed robbery because the world was changing and mercy is rarely free. He is shot during one botched attempt, left bleeding in the dirt by men who decide he is not worth the risk. He nearly starves one winter, wandering from town to town, turned away by people who see only a ragged thief. Each refusal, each threat, each betrayal hardens him. If Arthur is the living embodiment of Dutch's dream taken in and educated, John is the product of every door slammed in a child's face. So when Dutch finally encounters John, half-starved and half-feral, the pattern repeats from its humble beginnings. Another lost soul to save, another boy to mold. Dutch offers food, shelter, a coat against the cold, and, more importantly, a story. The gang is family, their outlaw life as a philosophy of freedom against a rigged civilization. Hosea sizes John up as a survivor. Dutch sees a son, but there is a crucial difference. Where Arthur leans in, eager to believe that this man in this camp can rewrite his fate, John hesitates. He enjoys the warmth of the fire, the shared jokes, the full plate. He respects Dutch's confidence and Hosea's wisdom. Yet some part of him never forgets the orphanage sermons that masked exploitation, the hollow promises that came before. When Dutch speaks about dreams, John listens. When Dutch speaks about destiny, John watches. That wariness becomes a quiet fault line running through the gang. John rides, robs, and kills alongside them, yet he keeps a piece of himself in reserve, an inner distance that even Abigail sometimes cannot cross. He wants what Dutch claims to offer, family, belonging, a future. But he also wants something Dutch rarely mentions, an endpoint. A small ranch, a wife, a son, a life where guns are tools, not identities. This tension will not vanish as the years pass. It will grow. Every grand plan that goes wrong, every corpse left behind, every time Dutch chooses the idea of freedom over the people in front of him, John files it away. He is loyal, but not blind. And when the gang's greatest disaster finally strikes, that old skepticism will collide with Dutch's unraveling dreams in a way that will change John's path forever. That tension between faith and doubt does not stay abstract for long. It hardens into two men, two temperaments, two futures sharing the same campfire. If Dutch and Hosea are the fathers of this wandering family, Arthur Morgan and John Marston are its rival sons. From the very beginning, Arthur is the dutiful child. Dutch finds him young, half feral and furious at the world, and turns that anger into purpose. Arthur learns to read Dutch's books, to parrot Dutch's speeches, to see the gang not just as a band of outlaws, but as a story of freedom and resistance in a corrupt civilization. He is introspective, often quiet, but his loyalty is loud. In the truest sense, he believes. John arrives later, and from his humble beginnings in an orphanage and on the streets, he brings a different energy. Restless, sarcastic, always testing boundaries, John never fully surrenders his skepticism to Dutch's philosophy. He disappears for stretches, chasing his own scores or simply running from responsibility, returning to camp with a smirk that says he expects both punishment and forgiveness. He is loyal, but he keeps a piece of himself in reserve. That difference matters. Dutch notices. To him, Arthur is the reliable right hand, the living embodiment of the gang's ideals. When there is a hard conversation, a dangerous ride, a bloody job, Dutch leans on Arthur without question. John, by contrast, is the prodigal son. Dutch praises his talent, his courage, his promise, then turns cold when John hesitates or talks of another life. One day, John is held up as the future of the gang. The next, he is berated for not being fully committed. Praise and punishment become the rhythm of their bond. That uneven treatment feeds early flashpoints. On jobs, Arthur pushes for discipline and planning, while John bristles at orders and improvises. When John vanishes for months after being wounded, Arthur sees it as abandonment, proof that John is irresponsible and selfish. John, in turn, watches Arthur excuse Dutch's crueler choices and wonders how a man so observant can be so blind. How can Arthur see the world as it really is and still bow his head to Dutch? Abigail and Jack complicate everything. John's attempt to build a small family inside the larger gang pulls him in two directions. Holding his son, he begins to imagine a future beyond robbery and flight, a quiet place where the old ways were dying and a man might simply work the land. Arthur, who has lost his own child and never truly healed, struggles to picture any identity beyond Dutch's cause. Family for him begins and ends with the camp. That difference will not stay theoretical. One day, on a cold mountain at the end of the world, Arthur will stand between Dutch's fading dreams and John's fragile hope, and in that moment, he will have to decide whether to ride with the father who raised him or finally place his faith in the brother who might yet escape. Arthur's choice on that distant mountain will define the end of this saga, but the path to that moment begins here, when the gang stops being just three men and becomes a moving world of its own. From its humble beginnings as a trio of drifters, the Van der Linde gang starts to turn into something larger, messier, and far more dangerous. As Dutch and Hosea's reputation spreads along rail lines and riverboats, through saloons and whispered campfire stories, they attract exactly the kind of people their philosophy promises to redeem. Misfits, deserters, and drunks, dreamers, runaways, and every lost soul who believes civilization has no place for them. Each new arrival brings a skill, a wound, and a desperate need for a new definition of family. One of the first is Bill Williamson, a former soldier, dishonorably discharged, carrying the kind of rage that never really cools. He drinks too much, fights too quickly, and understands discipline only when it comes from a shouted order or the crack of gunfire. Dutch sees something more. To the world, Bill is a violent failure. To Dutch, he becomes a loyal hammer, a man who can be pointed at a problem and told to pull the trigger. Then comes Javier Escuela, drifting north from Mexico with a guitar on his back and revolution in his blood. An idealistic gunslinger, part romantic, part fugitive, he speaks about freedom the way Dutch does, but with songs instead of speeches. When Dutch listens to him play by the fire, it feels for a moment as if the gang is the living embodiment of resistance. Not just another pack of outlaws on the run. Others follow in quick succession. A thief here, a card sharp there, a woman fleeing a violent husband, a man hiding from a debt he cannot pay. Each time, the pattern is the same. Dutch takes their shame and reframes it. They are not criminals, he insists. They are freedom fighters, pushed into the shadows by a corrupt civilization. Their robberies become protests. Their violence becomes necessity. Their presence in the gang becomes destiny rather than accident. That story is powerful. It binds them. It blinds them. The gang develops a rhythm that almost feels domestic. They set up camp near a town, pull a few jobs, charm or intimidate the locals, then vanish when the law grows suspicious or a rival crew starts asking questions. Tents go up, fires are lit, children play, horses are brushed and branded. Then, just as quickly, Everything is packed, saddled, and gone. Home becomes wherever the wagons stop. But expansion carries a hidden cost. More hands mean bigger scores, louder songs, fuller tables around the stew pot. They also mean more mouths to feed, more tempers to manage, more secrets waiting to turn into betrayal. Is this a family in the truest sense, or a powder keg rolling from county to county? For now, the illusion holds. Dutch stands at the center, Hosea at his side, Arthur and John as his right and left hands, and around them a growing circle of believers. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, is quietly loading its chambers. All it needs is a spark. That spark comes on a frozen mountainside, in a world of white and blood. The gang staggers out of Blackwater's disaster and into the blizzard at Coulter, half starved, half frozen, clinging to Dutch's voice in the dark. This is not the golden age. This is the hangover after the dream, the moment when even an idealistic philosophy of freedom can be buried under snow and fear. Yet the story does not stay in the storm. When the thaw comes and the gang rides down into the heartlands, to Horseshoe Overlook above the little town of Valentine, it almost feels as if the world is giving them one last chance. The camp opens up under wide skies. Horses graze, children run, and for a brief stretch of months, the Linde gang looks, in the truest sense, like a functioning family. Life at Horseshoe Overlook has a rhythm that hides the rot. At night, there is music by the fire, Karen and Mary Beth laughing, Javier playing guitar while Charles sharpens arrows in the glow. There are poker games where hard men bluff with pennies and pride, chores where Arthur hauls hay and chops wood, and easy banter that turns killers into uncles and brothers. Arthur's journal from this time is tired, wry, but still trusting. The writing of a man who believes Dutch will find a way, even if he is starting to feel worn down by the weight of that belief. Dutch thrives in this illusion. On the ridge above camp, or by the fire with a bottle in hand, he delivers speeches that are the living embodiment of his old charm. One last big score, one last train, one last bank, one last miracle that will buy their freedom forever. He paints Tahiti in bright colors, mangoes, clear skies, no more Pinkertons, no more civilization pressing in. Blackwater, he insists, was just a setback, a bad turn in a long road, not the beginning of the end. Who wants to believe otherwise? Valentine itself becomes a small theater for this fading golden age. The gang rides into town with a swagger that says the old ways were dying, but not dead yet. There is the bar fight with the local toughs, mud and fists and laughter in the street. There are small-time robberies, a stagecoach here, a drunken merchant there, even that darkly comic moment when an outlaw and his would-be victim both reach for the other's wallet. For a little while, they can still cause trouble and ride back to camp, confident the whole world will not crash down on them. But the shadow of Blackwater never really leaves. Pinkertons watch from a distance, patient and methodical, writing their own story of the gang in ledgers and dossiers. New technology creeps into the landscape. Telegraphs, railroads, the quiet bureaucratic machinery of a nation tightening its grip. The illusion of a golden age is already ringed with barbed wire. The question is not whether it will end, but how violently the dream will be torn away when Dutch's next plan demands more than the gang can afford to pay. On the surface, the gang's life between disasters looks almost ordinary. Men ride out to work, women tend the fire, children play under the watch of gunfighters who pass for uncles. But this is a story of labor paid in blood, of a family whose day job is robbery in a world that has already decided they are obsolete. From its humble beginnings as a two-man con, the Linde operation has become an economic engine running on stolen coin and borrowed time. Arthur, John, Javier, Bill, and the others hit trains and stagecoaches, rustle cattle, rob homesteads, and pull elaborate cons that Hosea scripts with theatrical precision. Every score, from a simple coach holdup to a bank job in Valentine, ends the same way. Riders returning to camp at dusk, dropping money into the donation box that keeps Pearson's stew pot full and the ammunition crates stacked. The early train robbery outside Valentine is the first real sign that the old ways were dying. Dutch targets a train belonging to Leviticus Cornwall, an industrial magnate who is the living embodiment of the new America. Railroads, oil, and influence stretching from boardrooms to backroom Pinkerton deals. The robbery goes wrong, the explosives misfire, and the gang is forced to improvise under fire. They still walk away with Cornwall's bonds, but the price is invisible at first. A man like Cornwall does not simply take the loss. He declares war. Life in camp becomes a cycle of motion and denial. Horseshoe Overlook above Valentine, then Clemens Point on the shore near Rhodes, then the ruined manor at Shady Bell and beyond. Each move is framed by Dutch as strategy, as freedom, as staying ahead of civilization's noose. In reality, every relocation is forced by rising heat from the law, rival gangs, or Dutch's own escalating ambitions. The world was changing, and the gang keeps pretending it is only changing towns. Within those camps, daily routines make the outlaw life feel, in the truest sense, domestic. Strauss sends Arthur to collect on predatory loans, turning the gang's philosophy of helping the poor into something colder and crueler. Pearson butchers game at his table, barking for more deer and more rabbits while the kids chase each other between the wagons. Women wash clothes, patch wounds, tell stories of better days. Tilly reads, Mary Beth writes, Karen drinks and laughs too loudly. Around the fire, Dutch delivers speeches about loyalty and dreams of one last score that will buy true freedom. Each success feeds his conviction. The Valentine antics, the brazen train jobs, the skirmishes with O'Driscolls that end with pockets full of cash all seem to prove that Dutch's philosophy still works. Yet with every train robbed, every telegraph line cut, every coach looted, the gang is not slipping away from civilization, but drawing its gaze. Telegraphs carry their descriptions. Railroads carry their enemies. Cornwall's money and his fury move faster than horses. In that tension between apparent prosperity and tightening pressure, the gang's working life becomes a slow fuse. The question is how long it can burn before Dutch's promise of one last score explodes into something none of them can control. That slow fuse is not burning in isolation. It is burning in a world that is transforming faster than any outlaw's horse can run. The world was changing, and the von der Linde gang is trapped at the fault line between two Americas. From the very beginning, Dutch and Hosea built their philosophy on the idea that the frontier was endless, that there would always be one more valley to disappear into, one more nameless town to rob and then abandon. That belief made sense in the 1870s, when railroads were still stitching themselves across maps and telegraph wires had not yet reached every settlement. But by 1899, the old ways were dying. Railroads knit the country together in iron and steam, carrying soldiers, Pinkertons, and rumors at a speed no posse could match. Telegraphs and newspapers finish the job. A robbery in one state becomes front-page news in another by morning. A description of Dutch or Arthur sent from St. Denis can arrive in Blackwater before the gang has even broken camp. What does it mean to vanish into the wilderness when wanted posters, telegrams, and federal warrants can outrun any fugitive? The story of the West is shifting from whispered legend to printed fact, and that is a disaster for men who survive on myth. Federal power grows along those same lines of copper and steel. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency, hired hounds of government and capital, is no longer a distant threat. It is the living embodiment of a new kind of civilization, where law can be purchased, weaponized, and delivered by rail. Men like Milton and Ross do not care about Dutch's speeches on freedom or his talk of corrupt systems. To them, the gang is not a romantic band of rebels. It is a problem to be solved, efficiently and permanently. Dutch refuses to see it. He speaks about the West as if it is still from its humble beginnings, an open canvas where a clever outlaw can redraw the map through willpower alone. While barbed wire fences carve ranches into grids, while corporations buy whole counties, he keeps promising Tahiti, promising one last score, promising that the gang can stay ahead of a world that has already overtaken them. His dreams harden into delusions, and every new invention feels to him like a personal betrayal. Leviticus Cornwall stands at the center of that new order. An industrialist with railroads, oil fields, and banks under his thumb, he turns landscapes into ledgers. His trains cut through the wilderness the gang once called sanctuary. His refineries choke the sky over towns that used to be quiet, and his money hires Pinkertons to hunt Dutch's family as if they were a bad investment to be written off. In the truest sense, Cornwall is Dutch's opposite. Where Dutch speaks of freedom, Cornwall practices control. The tragedy is that the gang keeps aiming their guns at men and institutions while missing their most implacable enemy. It is not just the law that is closing in, it is time itself, and Dutch von der Linde is already fighting a war that history has quietly decided he will lose. Time itself may be Dutch's real enemy, but the bullet that starts the end is fired in Blackwater. Before the blizzard, before the dead horse in the snow and the shivering camp at Coulter, there is a ferry on a dark river and a promise of one last perfect score. In Dutch's mind, this is the culmination of everything he has preached from its humble beginnings. A wealthy town on the edge of the new century, a boat loaded with cash and bonds, and a plan to strike at civilization's soft underbelly while calling it justice. Dutch tells them this will be the job that sets the family free forever, the living embodiment of his philosophy. Take from those who profit from progress and vanish before the world can close its fist. What actually happens is chaos. The details are fragmented, argued over, half whispered around later campfires, but the outline is clear. The gang hits the Blackwater Ferry. The law is faster and better organized than expected. Innocent civilians are caught in the crossfire. People scream, people fall, and Dutch, who once prided himself on not hurting bystanders, pulls the trigger on an unarmed woman. That single act, in the truest sense, marks the moment when his ideals and his fear collide. The law descends. Pinkerton agents, local deputies, and hired guns swarm the docks and the streets around them. Gunfire turns the riverfront into a killing field. Members of the gang go down, others barely escape, and in the rush to flee, crates of money and bonds are abandoned on the boat and in the blood-slick mud. The dream of a clean getaway dissolves into a panicked retreat toward the mountains, leaving bodies and fortune behind. Blackwater does not just cost them money, it changes Dutch. In Coulter, he stands in the freezing wind and insists the plan was sound, that betrayal or bad luck ruined it, that the world was changing faster than anyone could predict. His voice is still eloquent, still commanding, but there is a new edge, defensive, brittle, almost desperate. He cannot accept that his judgment failed, so he clings to the idea that the lost Blackwater money can be recovered, no matter how many new risks that obsession demands. Around the fire, Blackwater becomes a ghost that never leaves. Some quietly blame Dutch. Some mutter that Micah pushed too hard, fired too early, or whispered the wrong advice in Dutch's ear. Others, Arthur included, try not to dwell on it, because what good does it do to pick at the wound when survival is all that matters? Yet everyone knows that something broke that day, that the old ways were dying inside Dutch even as he kept preaching the same old speeches. For the Pinkertons, though, Blackwater is a gift. A blood-soaked justification to hunt this outlaw family without restraint, to turn a wandering gang into the most wanted criminals in the country. And among those agents, one man in a fine coat and polished boots will turn that mandate into a personal crusade, a story of pursuit that will not end until Dutch's dream, and everyone bound to it, lies in the dust. For the Linde gang, Blackwater is a catastrophe. For the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, it is an opportunity. In the truest sense, it is the moment when a roaming band of outlaws becomes a sanctioned target for civilization's hired guns. From its humble beginnings as a private detective firm, the Pinkerton Agency had already become the living embodiment of the new order sweeping across the West. Railroads, banks, and industrial barons did not just want guards. They wanted an army that did not have to answer to voters. Pinkertons broke strikes, infiltrated unions, and hunted anyone who threatened profit, calling it law and order while serving the invisible hand of capital. To men like Dutch, they were proof that the world was changing and that the old ways were dying. So when Blackwater ends with civilians dead on the docks and a ferry turned into a floating grave, the outrage gives the Pinkertons exactly what they need: political cover. Senators demand answers, newspapers scream for justice, and behind closed doors, contracts are signed. Dutch is no longer just a troublesome outlaw with a loud philosophy about freedom and corruption. He becomes a public enemy, a name that can justify almost any budget, any jurisdiction, any blood spilled in pursuit. Into this mandate steps Agent Andrew Milton. Well-dressed, controlled, with the cold patience of a man who believes history is on his side, Milton does not see Dutch's gang as romantic rebels or lost souls chasing dreams. In his reports and in his mind, they are a criminal enterprise. Bank robbers, murderers, kidnappers, a mobile contagion of defiance that must be contained. His partner, Edgar Ross, watches and learns, absorbing every detail, already preparing for a future in which government badges will replace private contracts, but the mission will stay the same. From the very beginning of the gang's flight after Blackwater, Milton treats the chase as a methodical campaign rather than a series of disconnected manhunts. He pressures local sheriffs, buys informants, leans on railroad schedules and telegraph lines. Every camp the gang establishes, from Coulter's frozen caves to Horseshoe Overlook's gentle hills, from the swamps of Shady Bell to the rot of Beaver Hollow, exists under an invisible crosshair. The gang rides, robs, and laughs around campfires, but the net tightens all the same. The psychological toll is immense. Where once Dutch could bribe a county lawman or outrun a posse and feel triumphant, now the pursuit never really ends. Strange riders appear on distant ridges. Questions follow them into every town. Pinkerton agents raid their camp at Horseshoe Overlook, storm the streets of Valentine, and later descend on St. Denis with rifles and warrants, turning Dutch's story of noble resistance into sheer survival. How long can a family live when every trail feels watched, every conversation overheard, every new ally a potential spy? Then, A pattern interrupt. No gunfire, no galloping horses, no grand speech about freedom. Just Milton, alone in a quiet office, lamplight pooling over a thick file. He turns pages filled with witness statements, grainy photographs, and neatly typed summaries of robberies stretching back years. His pencil underlines names with clinical finality. Dutch van der Linde, Arthur Morgan, John Marston, Javier Escuela, Bill Williamson. Each stroke is calm, almost bored, as though he is not hunting people but closing ledgers. In that silence, the fate of an outlaw civilization is reduced to ink on paper, and those underlined names begin to read less like suspects and more like future obituaries. Those underlined names are not the only danger closing in on the Van der Linde gang. While the Pinkertons assemble files and warrants, another threat walks in under its own power, smiling, laughing, and calling everyone friend. The story of the gang's collapse is not only about pressure from the outside, it is about rot from within. Micah Bell arrives late to this world of shared campfires and half-believed ideals. He is not from its humble beginnings, not a boy Dutch raised or a stray Hosea patiently reformed. He is a drifter in the truest sense, a ruthless gunslinger whose loyalty begins and ends with himself. Where Arthur carries the weight of history on his shoulders, Micah carries nothing but guns, grudges, and an appetite for chaos. He enjoys violence for its own sake, not as a tool for freedom or survival, and that alone marks him as something new in this outlaw family. From the very beginning, Micah understands how to play Dutch. He echoes Dutch's philosophy back at him with almost theatrical conviction, repeating phrases about destiny, about one big score, about civilization strangling the free man. When Dutch rants about the world changing, Micah nods and leans in, telling him he is right, that the old ways were dying because men with vision are persecuted. He tells Dutch he is a genius surrounded by cowards. Who could resist that kind of flattery, especially as plans begin to fail and doubts close in? Where Arthur questions, Micah accelerates. Arthur worries about children in camp, about Hosea's warnings, about how many bodies are being left behind in the dust. Micah pushes for more violence, bigger risks, fewer scruples. Rob the ferry in Blackwater, hit the bank in St. Denis, kill Column, kill Cornwall, kill anyone who stands in the way. When Arthur urges caution, Micah laughs, turning prudence into an insult. In Dutch's eyes, one man is becoming hesitant, almost disloyal. The other is the living embodiment of commitment. Micah is quick to notice the fractures already running through the gang. Sean's death, Jack's kidnapping, the failed scores and empty pockets, all of it leaves people angry, frightened, ready to blame someone. Micah feeds that resentment. He whispers that Molly drinks too much, that Strauss is a parasite, that John wants out. He suggests that Arthur's doubts are treason, that Hosea's skepticism is weakness. Each quiet conversation nudges Dutch a little further away from the voices that once grounded him. If Dutch and Hosea were the pillars that held this outlaw civilization upright, Micah is the infestation no one sees at first. He does not knock the structure down in one blow. He hollows it out, beam by beam, until the philosophy of freedom is little more than a mask for cruelty and delusions. By the time the camp finally collapses, the question is not who betrayed Dutch, but how early the betrayal began, and how much of it he invited in himself. Micah is the infestation, but rot spreads through more than one beam. As the gang settles into its new rhythm of desperation, another, quieter corruption takes hold, one that does not arrive with gunfire, but with ledgers, signatures, and broken families. Leopold Strauss becomes the bookkeeper of that decay. On paper, he is simply managing the gang's finances, extending credit to struggling farmers and desperate laborers. In practice, his loan sharking turns Dutch's proud band of outlaws into debt collectors for the very civilization they claim to despise. Arthur rides out not to rob railroad barons or corrupt magnates, but to harass sick men in collapsing shacks and widows who have nothing left to sell except their dignity. These visits are not grand robberies. They are small humiliations. A coughing rancher, clutching his chest, begs for more time. A poor immigrant family, already crushed by the world, watches Arthur rummage through their home for something of value. The work pays for bullets and bread, yet every coin carries a taste of ash. The story of the Van der Linde gang, from its humble beginnings as a crusade against the rich, now includes scenes where the revolutionaries bully the same downtrodden they once swore to protect. Arthur feels the shift first in his stomach, then in his journal. Late at night, by the fire, he sketches the faces of those he has shaken down and wonders, in the truest sense, what they are becoming. Are they still fighting a rigged world, or just another predator circling the weak? His words turn from dry observations to uneasy questions, as if the page is the only place he dares admit that Dutch's philosophy and Dutch's orders no longer align. John's doubts, by contrast, are loud and external. He disappears from camp for days, trying to carve out a life for Abigail and Jack that does not begin and end with Dutch's next speech. When he returns, arguments erupt. Dutch frames John's absences as betrayal, as a failure of loyalty to the family that raised him. John pushes back, insisting that real family means keeping a child out of the line of fire, not marching him toward the next doomed score. Freedom, for John, is starting to mean a cabin, a fence, and a boy who grows up without learning how to aim a revolver. Hosea watches all this with the weary eyes of an old fox who has seen too many traps. The world was changing, and he knows it. The old ways were dying, and the gang's wandering dream of permanent escape feels more and more like a story told to keep frightened children calm. Around the campfire, Hosea starts to say out loud what others only think, that perhaps it is time to stop running, to accept that civilization is closing in, to find some quiet corner and grow old instead of dying young. But Dutch is not ready to surrender his myth, so when a small routine collection job presents itself, an easy ride, a simple bit of pressure, nothing to worry about, he sends Arthur and a few men along without hesitation. No Pinkertons, no rival gang, no ambush waiting in the trees. Just the gang, its simmering tensions, and one bad decision that turns a mundane errand into the first real crack in the foundation. The danger, for the first time, does not ride up from the horizon. It rides in the same saddle. And on that quiet road, with no enemy in sight, someone in the Linde family makes a choice that will be impossible to take back. That choice ripples forward into the gang's next great gamble, because the answer to an internal wound is not reflection or restraint. For Dutch, in the truest sense, the answer is always a bigger score. Driven out of the bayous and back roads, the Linde gang rides into St. Denis, and it feels less like entering a town and more like stepping into another world. Electric lights burn away the dark, trams screech along iron rails, smokestacks rise over brick factories, churning out proof that the world was changing, that the old ways were dying, and that the frontier Dutch romanticized is already half a memory. The open plains and sleepy main streets of Valentine and Rhodes are replaced by crowded alleys, immigrant districts, and mansions guarded by iron fences. To Dutch, this city is an insult and an invitation. He stalks its boulevards railing against civilization, calling St. Denis a cancer built on exploitation and hypocrisy, the living embodiment of everything his philosophy claims to resist. Yet in the same breath, his eyes track the banks, the payroll wagons, the fat men in suits. If the gang can bleed this city dry in one perfect strike, will that not prove his dream was right all along? Or at least buy enough time to keep running from reality? The St. Denis Bank becomes that dream. Dutch, Hosea, Arthur, and the others plan it with almost theatrical precision. Disguises as guards and townsfolk, timed entries and exits. Hosea playing the conman outside, distracting the police with a fake investment scheme while the real work happens behind vault doors. It is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, wrapped inside one robbery. For a few minutes, it works. Gold is bagged, the vault is cracked. The gang moves like a single practiced machine, from its humble beginnings now operating in the heart of modern finance. Then the illusion shatters. The law does not stumble in late. The Pinkertons do not ride up after the fact. They are waiting. Doors slam, rifles rise, and the bank becomes a killing ground. Hosea is dragged into the street unarmed, still trying to talk, still believing words can diffuse a world built on guns. Milton executes him in front of Dutch and Arthur, not as a necessity, but as a message. With that single shot, the gang's moral center is torn out. The man who could talk Dutch down from the ledge, who could remind him of the very beginning and what their freedom once meant, is gone. Lenny dies on a rooftop moments later, cut down in the chaos as the gang scrambles across skylines and fire escapes. Others are wounded, scattered, or captured. The price of Dutch's ambition is no longer just money or a botched escape. It is family. Compared to Blackwater, this is a darker mirror. 2 grand scores, both ending in disaster, but the second robs Dutch of more than a payday. It robs him of Hosea, the last steady voice between conviction and madness. In that absence, Dutch's grief curdles into rage and paranoia, and the dream of one last job begins to sound less like a plan and more like a delusion that will drag everyone left even deeper into the abyss. And from the docks of St. Denis to the far-off island where Dutch flees next, that delusion only grows. On the streets of St. Denis, Dutch's delusion finally meets the cold machinery of civilization. The St. Denis bank job is supposed to be the grand correction, the last great act that turns years of running, bleeding, and burying friends into something meaningful. Instead, it becomes a public execution, not of a plan, but of the gang's conscience. The heist unravels quickly. Pinkertons swarm, sirens wail, and the ornate marble halls of the bank turn into a killing ground. Hosea, separated from the main group and taken at gunpoint, is dragged into the daylight in front of a crowd and a line of rifles. There is no rushed gunshot in an alley, no accidental death in the chaos. His capture and execution are calculated, staged, and theatrical, the living embodiment of a new world making a point. Milton does not just kill an outlaw, he parades an old man, an old philosophy, in front of St. Denis as if to say, the old ways were dying, and anyone clinging to them would die too. For the gang, the moment lands like a cannon blast. From its humble beginnings, this was a story of two men who always had a way out, who could talk or think themselves past almost any noose. Hosea was the one who knew when to walk away, who could see 3 moves ahead, who could turn Dutch's wild dreams into something survivable. Now he is gone in an instant, his body crumpling on a city street as the bank windows shatter and Lenny falls moments later. Shock gives way to a hollow, disbelieving grief. If the man who always had a plan can be marched out and shot in broad daylight, what chance does anyone else have? Dutch's reaction is not reflection, it is rupture. In the truest sense, he loses more than a partner. He loses the last voice that ever told him no. Instead of scaling back, instead of seeing Hosea's death as a warning, Dutch hardens into vengeance. He blames Milton, the Pinkertons, the city, even the gang's supposed disloyalty, but never himself. Each failure becomes proof that the world was changing against him, not that his own philosophy has rotted. So he clings even tighter to the fantasy of one last score, one last island, one last chance to prove he was right all along. Is it leadership, or is it delusion wearing the mask of destiny? For Arthur, the loss cuts deeper than strategy. Hosea was a second father, the man who taught him to read the world as it really was, rather than how Dutch imagined it to be. Without Hosea's perspective, Arthur finds himself alone beside a leader he barely recognizes, a man who talks of freedom while treating his own family as expendable pieces on a board. The gang's center of gravity tilts, and Arthur begins to feel that the dream itself has become a lost soul, wandering further from anything decent. And then, the gunfire fades. The chaos of St. Denis gives way to something quieter, crueler. Back at camp, Hosea's bedroll lies empty, his books stacked neatly, his maps still pinned and folded as if he might return to adjust them. No speeches, no plans, no gentle chiding about Dutch's temper. Only the distant echo of Dutch's voice, growing sharper and more unhinged in the darkness, spilling promises that sound less like hope and more like a storm rolling toward everyone who remains. In that silence, the gang's future has already changed. It just has not realized it yet. Hosea's silence leaves a vacuum, and into that empty space, Dutch's voice grows louder. The tragedy is that the words do not change. The meaning does. From the very beginning, Dutch's speeches had been the living embodiment of the gang's philosophy. Around campfires at Coulter or Horseshoe Overlook, he spoke of freedom and family, of resisting a civilization that crushed the poor while praising the rich. He promised a world where outlaws could be more honest than bankers, where loyalty meant more than law. And, for a time, his actions matched those promises in the truest sense. Early on, the gang robbed railroads and stagecoaches that belonged to oilmen and magnates, shared the take, fed the camp, and slipped coins into the hands of starving strangers. Dutch defended Arthur from the law as fiercely as he defended Jack from kidnappers. When he said they were brothers and sisters, it felt true. It was a story of loyalty and rebellion, of dreams and danger, from its humble beginnings on snowbound ridges to warm nights under lantern light. But St. Denis shatters that illusion. Hosea dies on the gallows, Lenny falls on the rooftop, and the city swallows the gang whole. In the aftermath, Dutch retreats into repetition. Have a little faith. One more score. One more big job and they can all walk away. The words echo through Shady Bell, through the swamps, through Beaver Hollow, even as every failed plan proves the opposite. How many times can a man say the dream is alive while standing in its grave? The more the world was changing, the more Dutch clung to slogans. His choices begin to contradict everything he preached. He abandons the people he once called family, leaving John to rot on the Sisika work island, dismissing Arthur's pleas as weakness. He tolerates Micah's cruelty, excuses torture and murder as necessary, and waves away the suffering of innocents in Guarma and the Lakota at Wapiti as acceptable collateral on the road to some mythical freedom. Arthur hears the hollowness first. Tuberculosis strips away his illusions, and each recycled line from Dutch lands heavier, more bitter. He challenges Dutch openly, asking where the money is, why John is left behind, why Micah is trusted over those who bled for years. John, burned by betrayal and near death, withdraws instead, slipping further from the campfire light, already half on the path that will lead to Beecher's hope. Others cannot let go. Bill, Javier, even Pearson cling harder to the old speeches, repeating Dutch's phrases as shields against the terrifying thought that the past decade has been built on sand. If Dutch is wrong, what does that make them? The old ways were dying, but Dutch refuses to die with them. His words, once a call to protect the powerless, become a mask for paranoia and pride. And those same speeches will not end at Beaver Hollow. They will echo years later on cliffs and canyons in Red Dead Redemption, where an older Dutch still talks about freedom as he leads lost soul after lost soul to pointless deaths. Those echoes do not just linger in canyons years later. They start to hollow out the man riding beside Dutch long before Red Dead Redemption, turning the gang's most loyal enforcer into the living embodiment of a question the gang has been running from since the very beginning. What does all this blood really buy? The answer begins, cruelly, with a routine job. Leopold Strauss sends Arthur to collect from a poor farmer named Thomas Downs, a man already coughing himself raw in the mud outside Valentine. The gang's debt business has always been one of its ugliest compromises with civilization, a way to fund dreams of freedom by squeezing the desperate. Arthur beats a sick man in front of his terrified wife and child, spitting in his face as Downs coughs and bleeds on him. In that moment, the gang's philosophy of helping the downtrodden curdles into quiet hypocrisy. In that moment, Arthur's marked. At first, nothing seems different. The world was changing, Pinkertons are closing in, Dutch is spinning wilder plans. Arthur rides, fights, and kills as he always has. But then come the small betrayals of the body, a cough that will not quite go away, a sudden wave of weakness in the middle of a gunfight, a collapse on the streets of Saint Denis that leaves him gasping as carriages rattle past. The old ways were dying, and so, silently, is he. The doctor in Saint Denis does not roar or moralize. He simply listens, taps Arthur's chest, reads the signs of a hard life and a bad infection, and delivers the verdict with clinical calm. Tuberculosis, advanced. There is no cure. There is no miracle train to rob, no last big score that can outrun this bullet. In a story of outlaws who have always believed they could shoot their way out of any corner, the quiet finality of that room hits harder than any ambush. From that diagnosis on, every ride feels different. With a ticking clock in his lungs, Arthur begins to look back as much as he looks forward. He questions not just Dutch's decisions, but his own history as Dutch's gun. Every homestead raided, every lawman gunned down, every debtor broken for Strauss. Faces blur together, but the guilt does not. Was this really about freedom, or just about men dressing up their appetites as philosophy? Illness sharpens his vision. He sees Thomas Downs' widow forced into prostitution in St. Denis, Jack used as leverage, Abigail dismissed, John abandoned. He watches Dutch protect Micah, flatter him, and ignore Hosea's memory, Mary Beth's kindness, Charles's quiet warnings. The gang that once felt from its humble beginnings like a family of misfits now looks, in the truest sense, like a machine that eats people. Arthur chooses, slowly but decisively, to step out of that machine. He will protect John and Abigail, he will help the people Dutch overlooks, and he will stop being just another weapon in Dutch's hand. But that choice, born from disease and clarity, places him on a collision course with Dutch's pride and Micah's ambition. When the shooting finally starts inside the gang itself, whose side can an ailing Arthur truly stand on? Arthur's decision to step out of Dutch's shadow collides with another, quieter rebellion already brewing in camp. While Dutch dreams of one last score and Micah whispers about loyalty and strength, John Marston is dreaming about something far more dangerous in the world of outlaws, a normal life. From the very beginning, John's arc has been a story of collision between family and freedom, between Dutch's grand philosophy and a simple desire to raise a child without gunfire in the background. He has Abigail, a woman who has seen the worst of this world, and Jack, a boy who reads adventure novels without realizing he is living inside a dying one. John is tired of running, tired of promises about Tahiti and freedom that never materialize, tired of being told that civilization is the enemy while watching civilization catch up to them with every train and telegraph line. His desire to leave does not appear overnight. Earlier, when the Blackwater disaster shatters the gang's illusion of control, John disappears. Wounded, angry, perhaps ashamed, he drifts away from the family that raised him and tries, briefly, to imagine life without Dutch. When he finally returns, scarred and defensive, Dutch takes him back into the fold, but something fundamental breaks in that moment. The man who once saw John as the living embodiment of the gang's future now sees a deserter. From then on, Every time John reaches for Abigail and Jack, Dutch sees betrayal. Every request to put money aside, every argument about risk becomes, in Dutch's mind, proof that John is unreliable. Dutch accuses him of cowardice, of wanting to run and hide while others stand and fight. John fires back that Dutch cares more about the gang's legend than the actual people bleeding for it. Is this really about freedom, or about Dutch refusing to admit the old ways were dying? Arthur stands between them, in the truest sense. To him, John is a brother, hot-headed and stubborn. Dutch is a father, proud and wounded. At first, Arthur echoes Dutch, calling John weak for disappearing, for letting Abigail put ideas in his head. But tuberculosis changes the angle from which Arthur sees the world. As his lungs fail, his clarity sharpens. He begins to understand that John's wish to leave is not weakness, it is sanity. If the gang is a sinking ship, why should Jack drown for Dutch's pride? That realization reframes everything. The arguments at camp are no longer just about plans and scores. They are about futures. One night, John stands at the edge of camp, watching Jack chase fireflies near the wagons, laughter soft against the distant thunder of a coming storm. In the background, Dutch and Micah huddle close, whispering about traitors and loose ends. Two possible futures share the same frame, a boy with a book and a chance, and a boy swallowed by the gang's paranoia. Only one of those futures will survive what comes next. Jack's laughter fades into the night, and in its place another sound begins to dominate the camp. Raised voices, slammed bottles, the raw edge of wounded pride. If the boy and his book are a fragile promise of the future, then what happens next is a brutal reminder of what this family has already become. Molly O'Shea had once been the center of Dutch's attention, the glamorous actress in his private drama, the living embodiment of his charm and confidence. Now, in the mud and shadows of Beaver Hollow, she is an afterthought. Dutch spends his nights whispering with Micah, plotting the next score, the next escape, the next grand speech about freedom. Molly watches, ignored, pushed to the margins of a world she helped sustain, until the silence curdles into rage. Her breakdown comes during one of Dutch's returns to camp, when tempers are high and nerves are frayed. Drunk, furious, and desperate to be seen, she staggers into the center of camp and screams that she is the traitor, that she told the Pinkertons about the St. Denis bank job. Is it true? The game never confirms it, and her slurred words sound as much like a plea as a confession, a last attempt to claw back Dutch's gaze. In the truest sense, it is less a betrayal than a cry from a lost soul who realizes the performance is over. The response is immediate and merciless. Before Dutch can even decide what to believe, Susan Grimshaw steps forward, gun in hand, the camp's old law made suddenly, violently literal. One shot. Molly falls. Only after the echo dies does it become clear that there is doubt, that nothing has been proven, that this execution was driven more by fear and exhaustion than by justice. Once, this gang claimed to protect its own. Now it kills its own on suspicion. Molly's death is not an isolated tragedy. It is a symptom. The old ways were dying inside the gang long before civilization closed in from the outside. The supposed code that once targeted the rich and corrupt has eroded into pure survival, into a story of paranoia, possessiveness, and wounded egos. If Dutch cannot control the world, he will at least control the people who still orbit him, even if that control is maintained through terror. Against this backdrop, another, quieter revolt takes shape. Leopold Strauss, the gang's bookkeeper, continues sending Arthur to collect debts from the poorest, the sickest, those who believe Dutch's promises of protection. These are not grand robberies or daring train jobs. These are visits to shacks and hovels, to coughing men and starving families where freedom is just a word used to justify cruelty. Arthur's illness and awakening make each of these collections harder to stomach. He sees the woman whose husband died after their encounter. He sees the children hiding behind doors. He sees that Strauss's ledger is written in other people's blood. One day, he finally refuses. In a rare moment of open defiance, Arthur drags Strauss's belongings out, confronts him in front of the camp, and orders him to leave. No speeches, no philosophy, just a line drawn where there used to be none. It is a small victory in a collapsing world, a single act of loyalty to a broader sense of right rather than to Dutch's shrinking circle. Yet even this moment cannot save the gang. Molly is dead, Strauss is exiled, and nothing about Dutch's course truly changes. What does it say when the only justice left comes from a dying man pushing out a parasite, while the supposed leader excuses murder and misery as necessary losses? These smaller betrayals and moral failures might seem trivial next to bank explosions and Pinkerton raids, but they are the slow poison in the gang's veins. Each ignored lover, each ruined debtor, Each body dropped without certainty or remorse is another thread snapped in the fabric of family. From its humble beginnings, this was always a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of freedom promised and then quietly revoked. By the time the final camps fall, the great treachery will not be a single bullet or a single informant. It will be the weight of 100 little compromises, the realization that the real betrayal began the moment the gang stopped living by its own code and started sacrificing anyone who did not fit Dutch and Micah's agenda, and the worst of those sacrifices is still to come. That slow, creeping betrayal inside the camp explodes in St. Denis. The grand bank job, promised as the answer to every problem, becomes the living embodiment of Dutch's failure. Hosea is executed in the street, Lenny is gunned down on a rooftop, and the dream of one last score dies under the electric glow of a modern city that proves, in the truest sense, that the world was changing and the old ways were dying. In the chaos, Dutch does not lead the gang to safety. He drives what remains of it onto a steamship, fleeing into the night with no real plan besides escape. That desperate choice strands Dutch, Arthur, Javier, Bill, and Micah on Guarma, a tropical island far from the American mainland, after a storm wrecks the ship and scatters the survivors. One moment, the story is all brick alleys and Pinkerton badges. The next, it is jungle heat, crashing surf, and unfamiliar flags. Guarma becomes a surreal interlude, almost a fever dream in the middle of a western. Lush green hills hide a brutal sugar plantation run by Alberto Fusar, where workers are chained, whipped, and worked to death to feed distant markets and a different face of civilization. A local rebellion simmers in the forests and caves, desperate men and women fighting for freedom against a corrupt tyrant. For Dutch, it is another stage, another audience, another chance to preach his philosophy of resistance. From the very beginning on Guarma, his rhetoric sounds familiar. He tells Hercule and the rebels that their struggles are his struggles, that outlaws and revolutionaries are brothers under the same sky. He speaks of throwing off chains, of refusing to bow to governments and companies that treat people as property. But beneath the speeches, his real focus is narrow. Every alliance, every promise is weighed against one question. Will this get him a ship and a way back to his own war? Dutch uses the rebels' cause as a tool, another excuse for violence and self-justification. He agrees to assassinate Fusar, to sabotage cannons, to storm forts, but each act is less about Guarma's future and more about Dutch proving to himself that he still has power, that his dreams have not curdled into pure delusions. Arthur watches this with growing alarm. Even in this strange new world, far from Blackwater and Rhodes, Dutch's choices feel more erratic, more self-centered, more dangerous. And always, Micah is there, whispering in Dutch's ear, backing his wildest plans, feeding his paranoia about traitors and weakness. He becomes the shadow Hosea used to fill, but twisted. Arthur, sick, exhausted, and increasingly disillusioned, sees the substitution for what it is, the philosophy of the gang being quietly rewritten in real time. What happens when the man who once saved lost souls becomes one himself? When the survivors finally claw their way back to the mainland, nothing has paused to wait for them. The Pinkertons are closer than ever. The gang is more fractured than when they left, and Dutch is further from reality than Guarma's shores would suggest. The fantasy of escape is over, so what is he willing to destroy now that there is nowhere left to run? The return from Guarma does not bring relief. It brings Beaver Hollow. From its humble beginnings in open valleys and sunlit clearings, the Linde camp had always tried to be the living embodiment of Dutch's philosophy. Tents in a circle, fire at the center, a makeshift town that pretended it could outrun civilization. Now the gang crawls into a damp wound in the earth, a cramped cave system buried in the woods, as if the outlaws have finally accepted what the world was changing them into. Not rebels on the horizon, vermin underground. Where Coulter had been frozen and severe, and Clemens Point had swayed with lanterns and river breezes, Beaver Hollow is claustrophobic. The walls sweat. The air stinks of rot, mildew, and unwashed bodies. Smoke from the cook fire clings to the low ceiling, turning every breath into a reminder that the old ways were dying. The camp no longer looks out across open country. It stares into trees that hide enemies, Pinkertons, and each other. The atmosphere reflects that shift. Arguments flare over nothing and everything, over rations, over guard duty, over whose turn it is to risk a bullet for a few dollars. Whispered conversations knot in the shadows, people hunching together, hands covering mouths, eyes flicking toward Dutch's tent. Cans of food vanish and reappear. Ammunition is tucked away in bedrolls. The communal ledger that once symbolized shared sacrifice turns into a bitter joke as hoarding replaces generosity. This is no longer a family around a fire. It is a story of loyalty strained to breaking, of dreams thinning into delusions. In the heart of the cave, Dutch and Micah begin to hold court. They sit half in darkness, half in the flicker of the fire, trading plans and venom. Micah feeds Dutch's paranoia, naming traitors, pointing at ghosts. Those who approach are sized up, measured, sorted, trusted or suspect, useful or expendable. In the truest sense, Dutch's philosophy of freedom has become a cage, and Micah is tightening the bars. Arthur walks through this place and sees it clearly. The young man who once believed from the very beginning that Dutch could build a different world now moves past bedrolls and hollow eyes, past Karen's shaking hands and Bill's defensive rage, and understands that what remains is not a grand experiment in freedom, but a refugee camp of lost souls. Exhausted, frightened people cling to a dream that has already bled out on the streets of St. Denis, while Dutch still insists salvation is just one job away. How many times has that promise been made? How many graves has it dug? Confrontations become inevitable. Arthur challenges Dutch openly now, questioning rescues that never come, bank jobs no one can survive, alliances with men like Colum's brother and the Braithwaite's mirror images. Voices rise, hands hover near holsters, and others begin to choose sides. Javier and Bill edging toward Dutch and Micah, Charles and Sadie drifting toward Arthur and John. For the first time, people speak plainly of leaving the gang entirely. Once, that would have sounded like betrayal. Now it sounds like survival. Then the pattern breaks. There is no grand speech, no showdown by the fire. Instead, in a quiet moment, Arthur sits in his dim corner of the cave and begins to pack a satchel. A few cartridges, a worn journal, a change of clothes for a man who may not live to wear them. His hands move with a calm that his chest no longer feels. The decision is already written in his eyes, even if his mouth has not yet spoken it. The gang's story is still moving, but Arthur Morgan has stepped onto a different path, and Beaver Hollow can no longer hold him. Arthur's decision to walk away from Beaver Hollow is the moment one man steps out of the fog, just as the gang itself disappears into it. Because while Arthur quietly chooses a different path, another choice has already been made in the shadows, one that will decide who lives, who dies, and who gets sold to the very civilization Dutch claimed to resist. From its humble beginnings, the von der Linde gang had enemies in every direction: lawmen, rival outlaws, the slow advance of railroads and telegraphs. But now, in the final camp, the most dangerous enemy is sitting at Dutch's fire. Micah Bell, the last major recruit, becomes the living embodiment of the gang's decay, smiling through blood and smoke while the Pinkertons close in with uncanny precision. Is it bad luck or something colder? The pattern is impossible to ignore. Every time Dutch reaches for one last big score, Milton and Ross seem already waiting. The trolley station job in St. Denis, the escape from Guarma, the ambush at Beaver Hollow itself, Pinkertons appear at the right place, at the worst time, with information they should not have. Micah is conveniently missing from certain raids or turns up just after the shooting stops, always with an excuse, always with another idea to push Dutch further. One outlaw's instincts begin to look a lot like someone else's reports. Milton's taunts make it clearer still. He knows too much, not only about the gang's movements, but about Dutch's doubts, Arthur's illness, John's desire to leave. That knowledge does not come from distant surveillance. It comes from inside the tent. The story of the gang's fall is a story of pressure from the outside and betrayal from within, grinding together until the family breaks. Micah understands Dutch's philosophy well enough to twist it. He casts himself as the only true believer, the last man still willing to do what must be done. He calls Arthur weak, accuses John of treachery, and insists that anyone who questions Dutch is working for the law. In the truest sense, he weaponizes the very language of loyalty and freedom that once held the gang together. How can a leader built on paranoia and pride resist the man who tells him he is still right? Dutch faces a tragic, quiet choice. Arthur, gaunt and coughing, warns him that Micah is the rat, that the world was changing while Dutch refused to see it. But Dutch looks at his dying son and sees failure, hesitation, a lost soul who has lost his nerve. Then he looks at Micah and sees energy, certainty, violence pointed in the direction his anger already wants to go. Between doubt and flattery, he chooses flattery. The irony is brutal. The man who preached family, who raised Arthur from the very beginning, sides with the traitor against his oldest, most faithful son, because the traitor tells him what he wants to hear. That single decision, to believe Micah over Arthur, will climb with them onto a cold mountain soon, and on that ridge, It will decide not just the fate of the gang, but the entire future of John Marston and his family. On that mountain, the argument that began in whispers at camp finally becomes a death sentence. The story has been building to this: loyalty and betrayal, dreams and delusions, a family that once promised freedom now marching toward its own execution. Arthur has already understood what Dutch refuses to admit. The gang is beyond saving. Too many lies told in the name of a broken philosophy. Too much blood spilled to protect a man who no longer protects his own. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Dutch chose ego over adaptation. In the truest sense, the van der Linde gang is now only a reflection of one man's pride, not a home for outcasts. Tuberculosis eats at Arthur's lungs, but clarity sharpens his mind. He watches Dutch abandon John in the chaos of St. Denis, hears Micah whisper poison, sees Abigail kidnapped, and realizes this is no longer a story of noble outlaws versus cruel civilization. It is the slow murder of a family from the inside. If anything is worth saving now, it is not Dutch's dream. It is John, Abigail, and Jack. So Arthur turns. He urges John to run, again and again, telling him to take his family and leave this dying world behind. He helps secure money where he can, clears paths through Pinkertons and bounty hunters, and pushes John toward a future that the gang's original ideals once promised but never delivered. Dutch and Micah, the living embodiment of the gang's decay, try to pull John back with one more score, one more fantasy of a big take that will fix everything. Arthur has finally learned that one more score is the oldest lie of all. This is where the choice branches. In the chaos at Beaver Hollow, Arthur can follow Micah back for the money, or ride with John toward the mountains and a slim chance at escape. On paper, it is a choice between treasure and survival. In reality, it is a choice between Dutch's selfishness and Arthur's hard-won conscience. The high honor path, helping John, is Arthur rejecting Dutch's delusions and accepting that his own redemption lies not in gold, but in giving another man a chance to live differently. The final ride up the mountain is a funeral march for everything Arthur used to believe. Sick, exhausted, coughing blood into the cold air, he fights through Pinkertons and former brothers, not to protect an outlaw legend, but to carve out one last road for John. From its humble beginnings, this gang claimed to be about freedom. Now that promise survives only in the possibility that John's boy might grow up far from Gunsmoke. On the ridge, the sun bleeds into the horizon as Dutch, Micah, and Arthur face each other among the rocks. Years of shared history hang between them: robberies, campfires, a father and son who lost each other long before this climb. Arthur lays out the truth, forces Dutch to look at Micah's betrayal, at Hosea's death, at the bodies left behind. Will Dutch finally see what he has become, or will he walk away from his last remaining son one final time, leaving Arthur to die alone on that mountain? On that mountaintop, the story of the Van der Linde gang narrows to three silhouettes against a dying sky. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and here stand the men who tried to outrun that truth. Arthur, broken but awake; Micah, the living embodiment of every betrayal; and Dutch, the dreamer who cannot face what his dream has become. The standoff begins almost quietly. Snow drifts, wind howls, guns hang in the air, then it explodes. Arthur and Micah crash into each other with years of resentment behind every punch, rolling through the snow, clawing for weapons, biting and bleeding in the truest sense of an outlaw reckoning. Dutch watches, coat whipping in the wind, as his past and his present tear each other apart. One man he raised from his humble beginnings, another he let whisper poison into his ear. Arthur fights for more than survival. Tuberculosis has already written the end of his story. Every breath is a debt. He fights for John, for Abigail and Jack, for the memory of Hosea's quiet wisdom. When he finally drags himself up, gun shaking, he does not beg for his own life. He makes one last plea to Dutch. See Micah for what he is. Remember who they were supposed to be. Remember the philosophy that once promised freedom and family, instead of paranoia and slaughter. His words cut through the storm. Arthur points to the bodies left in their wake, to Blackwater, to St. Denis, to Hosea and Lenny, and all the lost soul drifters who believed in Dutch's dreams. Is this what it was all for? A rat on a mountain, counting blood money while civilization closes in from every side? Dutch hesitates. For a heartbeat, the very beginning of his idealistic vision flickers behind his eyes. Train robberies framed as rebellion, campfires where loyalty meant something. His gun shifts between Arthur and Micah. Pride pulls one way, memory another. He could end it here. He could admit he was wrong. He could save his son. He does nothing. Paralyzed by ego and fear, Dutch holsters his gun and turns his back on them both. He walks away, leaving Arthur to die and Micah to gloat, trapped between the man he once was and the delusions he refuses to abandon. In that single choice, he locks in the tragic trajectory of everyone's future. Arthur's end changes only in detail, never in meaning. Whether he dies peacefully, watching the sunrise after buying John time to escape, or is finished off in the dirt by Micah's bullets on the low honor path, his final act is the same. He chooses others over himself. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, resolves into one man finally breaking the cycle. Then the mountain goes silent. Cut. Snow, stillness. Arthur's body fading into legend. And far away, John Marston rides on, a small figure against a vast horizon, carrying Arthur's lessons and Dutch's ghosts into an uncertain future. The mountain falls quiet, but the echo of Arthur's last stand rolls down into Beaver Hollow, into every broken campfire and half-packed wagon the gang leaves behind. A story of loyalty and betrayal does not end with one death. It splinters, sending shards into every surviving member, cutting them away from the family they once believed would last forever. In the days and hours after that final ride, the von der Linde gang does not simply disperse. It detonates. At Beaver Hollow, Dutch's dream of freedom collapses under the weight of Pinkerton bullets and Micah's whispered poison. The camp, once the living embodiment of their philosophy, becomes a killing ground. Bill Williamson and Javier Escuela fire wildly in chaotic retreats, less a unified defense than a desperate scramble. Some outlaws fall nameless in the mud, swallowed by the forest and forgotten by history before their bodies even grow cold. The last shootouts are not grand robberies or noble last stands. They are arguments settled with gunfire. In the truest sense, the gang turns its guns inward. Molly O'Shea is already dead, shot down after a drunken confession that might have been truth or might have been a plea for attention. Leopold Strauss is cast out earlier, exiled for the very cruelty that once funded the camp, a lost soul wandering toward an unseen end. Now, at Beaver Hollow, Susan Grimshaw, the iron backbone of camp discipline, dies in the chaos, another pillar kicked out from under Dutch's crumbling world. As Pinkertons close in, some simply vanish. Karen Jones drinks herself toward oblivion, her sharp wit dulled by a future without scores or purpose. Tilly Jackson escapes the outlaw life entirely, disappearing into civilization and eventually building a quiet, honest life that would have seemed impossible from its humble beginnings in that ragged caravan of thieves. Mary Beth finds a pen instead of a pistol, trading holdups for novels. Others are captured or killed off-screen, their fates reduced to rumors in saloons and half-remembered names in government files. And at the center of it all, Dutch walks away. Not in handcuffs, not in a blaze of glory, but into the wilderness, coat flapping, eyes hollow. How does a man who built an entire world on speeches and grand gestures leave with no explanation? He simply steps into the trees and is gone. The old ways were dying, his philosophy shattered, yet he refuses to face judgment, becoming a ghost that haunts every survivor. For those who live, the cost is not just blood, it is guilt, anger, and gnawing doubt. Were they ever a family, or only accomplices in one man's delusions? Each survivor carries a different answer, a different wound. And for John Marston, riding away under that vast horizon, this collapse is not an ending at all. It is the beginning of another story, where the same government that hunted the gang will weaponize his past to threaten his new family and try to finish what Beaver Hollow started. For John Marston, the ashes of Beaver Hollow are not a conclusion, but a sentence deferred. The gang is gone, the grand philosophy has collapsed, yet the consequences of those years still cling to him like gunpowder smoke that refuses to clear. He rides away from that broken camp physically scarred, his face marked by old bullets and new beatings, his body worn down by winters on the run and summers in the saddle. Inside, he is worse. Every quiet moment becomes a gallery of ghosts. Arthur gasping on that ridge, Hosea smiling in the firelight, Dutch walking away into the mist. It is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, echoing in one man's memory. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and John is caught between what he was and what he might still become. In the epilogue, the camera follows him not as a legendary gunslinger, but as a man trying to disappear into honest work. He drifts through the West as a ranch hand, mending fences, breaking horses, hauling hay instead of loot. When violence finds him, he sells his gun for lawful causes, defending ranchers from rustlers or stagecoaches from bandits. The irony is sharp. The former outlaw now hunting outlaws so he can afford food and a roof. From its humble beginnings, his new life is small, fragile, and constantly under threat from his own reputation. Arthur's final words haunt him more than any wanted poster. Be a good man. Protect your family. Don't make the same mistakes. Those memories become his compass in the truest sense, a quiet counter-argument to Dutch's speeches about freedom and civilization. Where Dutch chased grand scores and abstract ideals, John tries to chase paydays that keep Abigail and Jack fed, and nights that end without gunfire. Yet every time his temper flares or his hand drifts toward his revolver, the image of Arthur's ruined face pulls him back from the edge. Rebuilding trust with Abigail and Jack is slower than any cattle drive. Abigail has heard promises before, from the very beginning of their relationship, and each broken camp has left another crack. She watches John work, counts the days he comes home sober and on time, and still wonders, is this a man or just an outlaw playing rancher? Jack, distant and bookish, flinches at raised voices and studies his father as if trying to understand a character in a story he never wanted to read. John fumbles through fatherhood, teaching Jack to ride, to shoot, to respect the land, even as he prays the boy will never need those skills. Around campfires and in dusty bunkhouses, a new dream begins to form. A ranch of his own, a place that belongs to them, a home that cannot be uprooted by the next posse or Dutch's next plan. It sounds suspiciously like an old promise, the living embodiment of Dutch's talk about a better world somewhere over the horizon. But this time, John wants it smaller, grounded, real. The question is simple and terrifying. Can a man who spent his life burning down other people's homes truly build one that lasts? And as a familiar name, Beecher's hope starts to whisper through his thoughts. The past begins to circle back toward him, bringing with it an offer, a threat, and a chance that will either secure that dream forever or destroy it before the first fence post is in the ground. Beecher's hope begins, in the truest sense, as a compromise between worlds. The name comes from a dead rancher with no heirs, a quiet casualty of a frontier that had already passed him by. Through a tangle of favors, signatures, and unspoken threats, John acquires the land not by gunfire, but by negotiation that still smells of the outlaw trail. He leans on old allies. Uncle's half-truths about the property, Sadie Adler's willingness to persuade a reluctant seller, Charles Smith's quiet presence that turns tense meetings into agreements. It is not a robbery, but it is not clean either. A government clerk is nudged with a bribe, a local landowner is reminded of debts, and John realizes that even walking toward civilization, his boots still track in mud from the old ways. This is the last time the line between legal and illegal blurs for him, and he feels it. Once the papers are signed, the real work begins. The story shifts from gunsmoke to sawdust. John hammers boards until his hands split, lifts beams where once he lifted safes, and spends long days breaking horses instead of breaking open train cars. Each post hole he digs is as exhausting as any mountain ride with Dutch, but now the reward is a roof, not a score. The world was changing, and for the first time he is trying to change with it. From its humble beginnings, Beecher's hope is nothing more than a skeleton of a house, a rough fence, and a few hopeful rows of crops. Abigail watches him from the doorway, arms crossed, weighing every swing of the hammer. For her, every improvement is a test. Will this hold, or will his old life pull him away again? Jack trails behind his father, passing nails, asking questions about seeds and seasons. For John, every answer is a promise that his son will grow up knowing books and birdsong, not wanted posters and aliases. Yet the ghosts move in before the furniture does. Arthur's hat hangs on a peg by the door, worn and sun-faded, the living embodiment of a man who died to give John this chance. A familiar revolver, once Arthur's, rests in a drawer, rarely drawn but never far. Dutch's phrases slip into John's speech when he is tired, little sermons about freedom and family that make him flinch the moment he hears them. Sometimes he pauses at the fence line, staring toward the horizon as if expecting riders, Pinkertons, or old gang members to crest the hill and drag him back into the story he thought he'd left. Beecher's hope becomes a strange monument, a ranch built on ghosts, a story of loyalty and betrayal buried under fresh-cut lumber. The old ways were dying, but they had not yet been laid to rest. And then, one evening, the pattern breaks. No gunfire, no speeches. Just Abigail setting a simple meal, John and Jack trading quiet words at a rough wooden table, the soft clink of cutlery and the low hum of crickets outside. The family eats in peace, unaware that, in some distant office where suits replace spurs, powerful men are already unfolding maps, whispering his name, and planning the knock on that very door. The knock finally comes on a quiet morning. No thunder of hooves, no posse on the horizon, just the dull, official rap of knuckles on wood that feels, in the truest sense, more dangerous than any gunshot John has ever heard. On the porch of Beecher's Hope stand two men who are not Pinkertons, yet carry the same cold certainty. Edgar Ross, sharp-eyed and smug, and Archer Fordham, quieter but no less committed, introduce themselves not as hired guns, but as representatives of the United States government. This is no private feud, no personal grudge. This is civilization itself, knocking on the door of the last outlaw trying to live as a farmer. From the very beginning, their presence makes it clear that the world was changing. The federal government is consolidating power, stretching its reach across territories that Dutch once swore no law could tame. Where the von der Linde gang used rhetoric about freedom and family to justify robbery, Ross and Fordham used badges, paperwork, and the language of duty. Their philosophy is simple and terrifying. The old ways were dying, and men who refused to bend would be broken. John refuses at first. He has a ranch to run, fences to mend, a son to raise. He has spent years clawing his way out of that life, haunted by Arthur's sacrifice and Dutch's collapse. But Ross is not asking. He is informing. Abigail and Jack vanish into government custody, spirited away to some distant, unnamed location. Their safety becomes a contract written in invisible ink, signed with John's past. The leverage is brutal and efficient. Hunt down Bill Williamson, Javier Esquella, and finally Dutch van der Linde, or never see the family again. It is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions repackaged as a federal operation. Where Dutch once saved John by dragging a lost soul into an outlaw family, the government now promises to save John's family by dragging him back into sanctioned violence. Redemption becomes a performance, staged for the benefit of men in suits. John understands the irony better than anyone. He does not want to kill Bill or Javier, men who once rode beside him, laughed with him, bled with him. Yet he knows what they are capable of when cornered, what Dutch's broken philosophy has turned them into. If he refuses, who will Ross send next? Someone with no history, no hesitation, no reason to show mercy. So John saddles his horse. No gang at his back, no campfire speeches, no idealistic talk of freedom. He rides out alone, not as an outlaw chasing money, but as a man chasing the ghosts of his own past, each target a ruined fragment of the van der Linde dream, each encounter another reminder that from its humble beginnings, this was always heading here. And somewhere out there, Dutch is waiting, the living embodiment of everything John must finally face. John's trail leads him to a familiar name wearing an unfamiliar crown. Bill Williamson, once the gang's unstable bruiser, now squats in an old Confederate fortress and calls it a kingdom. Fort Mercer becomes his castle, its crumbling walls and rusted cannons a story of a man trying to hide from the world, from his past, and from the fact that the old ways were dying whether he accepted it or not. In the von der Linde days, Bill had been volatile, insecure, and desperate for approval. But there had been loyalty there, a crude belief in Dutch's philosophy of freedom and family. He was the man Dutch pointed at something and it disappeared. Now, years later, that same wounded soldier has turned himself into a paranoid warlord, surrounding himself with cutthroats and deserters, men who respect only fear. From its humble beginnings as a ragged outlaw hideout, Fort Mercer transforms into a monument to Bill's terror and delusions. Bill has learned all the wrong lessons from Dutch. He parrots the speeches about strength and loyalty, about standing against a corrupt civilization, but the ideals are hollow. Where Dutch once cloaked his crimes in grand dreams, Bill turns those words into blunt weapons, using them to justify shaking down ranchers, executing dissenters, and ruling the local population through intimidation. He is, in the truest sense, Dutch's shadow without Dutch's light. No charisma, no vision, just rage wrapped in secondhand philosophy. When John rides to Fort Mercer, he does not come as a faceless lawman. He comes as a ghost from the very beginning, a reminder of campfires, shared scores, and the night Dutch pulled both of them out of the mud. John calls out to Bill from beyond the fort's gate, appealing to their shared history, to the man who once followed Dutch not for power, but for belonging. There is a brief, brittle moment where it almost sounds like two old comrades arguing outside a saloon instead of across a battlefield. But Bill is too far gone. Pride will not let him admit fear. Anger will not let him forgive what he sees as John's betrayal. And under it all, there is terror. Terror of being weak again, of being the drunken, broken soldier Dutch once found. So he mocks John, refuses the offer of a way out, and answers memory with gunfire. Forced into alliance with the very government hunting him, John helps orchestrate an assault on Fort Mercer. The irony is brutal. Once, he robbed trains and banks in the name of striking back at civilization. Now he rides beside U.S. soldiers and opportunists, storming a fort held by a former brother. Explosives rip through the gates, horses crash through dust and smoke, and the courtyard becomes a chaotic echo of every botched job the gang ever ran, only this time the banner overhead is the flag of the state. When the dust settles, Fort Mercer falls, but Bill does not. He slips away south, across the river into Mexico, chasing refuge in a land simmering with revolution and betrayal. John follows, riding out of the ruined fort and into a new world of crumbling regimes, self-proclaimed saviors, and recycled ideals, a world that will mirror Dutch's chaos on a national scale. And somewhere beyond that border, another broken dream is waiting to be exposed. Mexico is not a refuge. It is a mirror held up to the gang's past, a country tearing itself apart under banners of freedom, justice, and reform, while the soil drinks the blood of peasants and soldiers all the same. Revolutionaries, federal troops, and regional warlords all claim to be the living embodiment of the people's will, yet every burned village and mass grave tells a different story. John rides into this world of uniforms and slogans and finds something painfully familiar. Colonel Allende's federal regime promises order and civilization, but rules through executions, corruption, and fear. Abraham Reyes shouts about liberty in the future, yet treats the revolution as a stage for his ego and appetites. Between them, nameless captains and bandits swap sides whenever it suits survival. It is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, only now played on a national scale instead of around a campfire. Caught in the middle of this chaos stands Javier Escuela. From the very beginning, he had been one of Dutch's most idealistic followers, a Mexican outlaw who believed that stealing from the powerful could be a form of justice. Dutch's philosophy of freedom from government, of family against a rigged world, spoke directly to a man who had already seen oppression in his homeland. Javier listened when Dutch railed against civilization and its hypocrisies, and he believed. Years later, that belief is curdled. In Mexico, Javier drifts between federal officers and revolutionaries, trading information, protection, and guns. He claims to be helping the right side, yet his choices are driven less by ideals and more by the simple need not to end up on a firing line. The old ways were dying, and Javier, once so sure of Dutch's grand design, now clings to whichever commander offers him another day to breathe. John is forced to navigate this same moral swamp. To reach Javier, he serves Allende, then turns around and aids Reyes, watching both men justify atrocities with the same polished phrases Dutch once used about necessary violence. Each mission peels back another layer, rescuing prisoners for one tyrant, helping topple another, always with promises that the next victory will finally bring freedom. How different is this from Dutch promising that the next score will finally save the gang? When John finally corners Javier on a rocky cliff above the Mexican River, the confrontation is not a grand showdown between legends. Javier pleads and argues, insisting he is still fighting for something bigger, that he is a revolutionary, not just a hunted outlaw. He blames the government, the world, even Dutch's fall. John sees only another lost soul trapped by his own history, another man who mistook rhetoric for redemption. And then comes the break in the pattern. There is no operatic duel, no heroic last stand. Javier is hauled away in chains or dies with a whimper in the dust, his fate swallowed by reports and shallow graves. From its humble beginnings in Dutch's campfire speeches to this inglorious end, his arc proves a quieter truth. Most revolutions, like most gangs, do not end in legend. They end in paperwork, in silence, and in names that history barely remembers, even as John is pushed toward the next ghost from his past. Those ghosts do not give John a moment to breathe. No sooner is one name crossed out in blood and paperwork than another rises from the past, and at the end of that chain stands the man who began it all, Dutch van der Linde. When John finally finds Dutch again, the prophet of the open road is almost unrecognizable. His hair is grayer, his face more lined, his eyes more haunted. The once charismatic outlaw who could hold a camp in thrall now stalks the high mountains at Cochiné, surrounded by a new gang of native followers and a few desperate outcasts, preaching the same sermons about freedom and government oppression. But the cadence has changed. The fire is there, yet the coherence is gone, replaced by bitterness and paranoia. In the truest sense, Dutch has rebuilt his old dream in miniature. These dispossessed native warriors, driven off their land and pushed to the margins of a world that no longer wants them, are exactly the kind of people he claimed to fight for from the very beginning. To them, he is a leader, a shield against civilization, the living embodiment of resistance. In reality, he is using them the way he used Arthur, Hosea, and John, as pieces in a personal war against a world that dared to move on without him. The irony is almost cruel. A man who once condemned the government for exploiting the vulnerable now does the same thing, hiding his delusions behind talk of philosophy and destiny. What began as a story of idealistic rebellion has curdled into a bunker cult in the snow, loyalty demanded at gunpoint, dreams enforced with dynamite. So the mountains become a final battlefield. John rides with government agents and soldiers, the very forces Dutch swore to oppose, pushing higher into the Rockies as Dutch sets ambushes, plants explosives, and turns every narrow path into a killing ground. Between rifle cracks and falling rock, his voice drifts across the cliffs, ranting about the death of the West, the march of civilization, the inevitability of state control. The world was changing. The old ways were dying. Dutch is right about that, but for all the wrong reasons. At the end of the climb, there is nowhere left to run. Cornered on a cliff edge, wind tearing at his coat, Dutch faces John one last time. There is no grand shootout, no heroic duel, only two relics staring at each other, both knowing how far they have fallen. Dutch tells John that men like them will always be used and discarded, that the government will never stop, that this is how their story has to end. Then he chooses the only freedom he has left. He steps backward into the void. Dutch's body shatters on the rocks far below, but his words linger in the cold air. And even as John looks down, the agents behind him are already calculating, already deciding what to do with the last surviving witness to this broken philosophy now that his usefulness is almost over. Dutch's body is gone, but the bargain he died for still hangs in the air. John has done what the government demanded. Bill is dead. Javier is gone. Dutch has fallen. On paper, the ledger is clean, the debt paid. But this is not a story of honorable contracts and mutual respect. This is a story of leverage, of control, of a state that sees outlaws as tools to be used, then discarded. From the very beginning of John's hunt, Edgar Ross never promised freedom in the truest sense. He promised the removal of a threat. He promised that if John helped civilize the last wild corners of the map, his family might be allowed to exist on the margins. Even in that moment on the cliff, as Ross watches Dutch die, he is not thinking about John's redemption. He is thinking about loose ends. For a brief time, though, it feels as if the deal holds. John returns to Beecher's Hope, that rough little ranch that grew from its humble beginnings in the epilogue of Red Dead Redemption 2 into a fragile dream of stability. He fixes fences, breaks horses, and works the land under a sky that finally seems quiet. Abigail comes home. Jack reads on the porch, trying to understand a world that keeps insisting the old ways were dying. The Marstons share awkward dinners, small arguments, and rare laughter. John, the former outlaw, tries to become the living embodiment of the settled man he once mocked. Those months are mundane, and that is what makes them precious. The story slows. Gunshots are replaced by the creak of barn doors, the lowing of cattle, the rhythm of chores. John begins to believe, against all reason, that civilization might let his family be. Yet beneath that calm, Ross is still watching. How long can a government that built its case on John's monstrosity tolerate his quiet humanity? The answer arrives in dust and gunpowder. One morning, the horizon around Beecher's Hope darkens with riders and soldiers, federal troops and Ross's men moving in a methodical ring. There is no warrant, no negotiation, no pretense. They are not there to talk. They are there to erase. The ranch is surrounded, escape routes quietly cut off, the noose tightening around a man who already surrendered his freedom. Inside the house, John understands. This is betrayal, but it is also confirmation of everything Dutch once ranted about. The world was changing, and men like them were never meant to survive that change. John rushes Abigail and Jack to the back, shoving them toward the horses, toward whatever slim chance the horizon still offers. Then he turns towards the barn. That walk is his final act of loyalty, to family, to a promise he intends to keep, even as the government breaks theirs. In the barn, Light cuts through the slats in thin, holy beams. John pauses, hand on the door, hearing the soldiers outside ready their rifles. What choice does he have? He opens it. The world explodes into gunfire. Ross stands among the firing line as John steps out, exposed, drawing against an entire wall of rifles. The hail of bullets that tears through him is not justice. It is cleanup, a bureaucratic solution written in blood. John staggers, riddled with lead, and falls face first into the dust of the ranch he built. For a moment, everything is still. The government rides away, satisfied. The last major witness to Dutch's philosophy is gone. But the story does not end with John's body, because Jack Marston is watching. And the cycle of violence, of dreams and delusions, is already reaching for the next generation. What does a boy do when civilization murders his father in broad daylight? Jack Marston's story begins in the dust of camps and the shadows of campfires, not in the safety of a schoolhouse. From the very beginning, his world is wagons, whispered plans, and the constant threat of flight. He grows up listening to Dutch talk about freedom and civilization, hearing Arthur's low voice steadying the chaos, feeling his father's rough hand on his shoulder as gunshots echo in the distance. For a child, the gang is simply family. Coulter's frozen caves, Horseshoe overlooks open fields, Clemens Point's humid nights, Shady Bell's rotting halls. Each camp is home for a few brief months, then another memory left behind. Jack learns to read under Dutch's grand speeches and Hosea's gentler corrections, clutching adventure novels while men clean blood from their coats. It is, in the truest sense, a story of innocence trying to bloom in a garden planted with violence. Then the camps disappear. The gang fractures. Years later, Beecher's Hope offers something new: a ranch, a bed, a routine. John tries to trade robbery for fence posts and cattle, to prove that an outlaw can become a husband, a father, a citizen. For a while, Jack rides the pastures, chases rabbits instead of bounties, and hears more about chores than about scores. From its humble beginnings as a half-finished homestead, the ranch feels like a different philosophy made real. Civilization destroys that illusion in an instant. Federal agents ride in not as monsters but as officials, as the supposed living embodiment of order. They call John a criminal, promise Abigail and Jack a future, and then murder him in a hail of bullets on his own porch. Jack sees the state that claimed justice reveal its betrayal in broad daylight. The dreams of a peaceful life die with his father in the mud. Abigail understands the pattern. She has seen Dutch's ideals curdle, Arthur's sacrifice ignored, John's surrender repaid with death. Determined to break the chain, she moves Jack away, away from Beecher's Hope, away from the shadow of the barn where his father fell. She pushes books, education, stories of a wider world where a man's worth is not measured by his draw speed. Her hope is simple and desperate, that her son will not become another lost soul claimed by someone else's cause. But ghosts travel. Jack grows into a young man carrying three legacies at once: Dutch's rhetoric about freedom, Arthur's quiet repentance, John's stubborn effort to change. He has read about heroes and villains, about nations rising as the old ways were dying, and he knows his family's story sits uneasily between those lines. How does a boy raised among outlaws reconcile those pages with the reality of firing squads and unmarked graves? One day, he rides back to Beecher's Hope. The ranch is quieter now, the fence is sagging, the fields half-tended. No Abigail calling from the doorway, no John cursing at stubborn cattle, only wind, creaking boards, and memories. The place that once promised a future now feels like a monument to everything the world took from them. Yet something has changed. Jack is no longer the child hidden behind barrels during gunfights. He is old enough to choose. Standing among the ghosts of Dutch's gang, he can follow the path of revenge, or he can follow the path his mother begged him to walk. The philosophy that once swept up Arthur and John now waits, silently, for his verdict. At his father's grave, the moment crystallizes. Jack stands not with a revolver already drawn, but with a book in his hand. One hand on the past, one on the possibility of another life. Two futures still possible, even this late in the story. As the world was changing and the next chapter of the Marston legacy waits to be written, the choice does not hold. Time moves on, and the next chapter of the Marston legacy is written not in ink, but in gunpowder and river water. Years pass after John's death, and the boy at the grave hardens into a young man who can no longer live only in books. The world was changing, but one thing remains fixed in Jack's mind: the name of the man who led his father to the slaughter. Jack's hunt for Edgar Ross is not a grand quest announced to the world, but a slow, stubborn pursuit conducted on dusty roads and in quiet conversations. He follows rumors through towns that barely remember the Linde gang, asking after a retired government man who once hunted outlaws for a living. In Blackwater, in the very shadow of the disaster that began this spiral, he learns Ross has left the city and spends his days near the river, hunting birds instead of men. From its humble beginnings as a boy's whispered vow, the search becomes a story of obsession, of a son tracing the footsteps of the very civilization that destroyed his family. By the time Jack finds Ross's brother first, the irony is almost cruel. Two men on a porch, each measuring the other, each hiding a gun into history. The brother points Jack downriver, to a camp by the water where Edgar Ross passes his retirement with a shotgun, a bottle, and the delusion that his work is done. The old ways were dying, but the ghosts of those ways have long memories. When Jack finally approaches Ross on the riverbank, the confrontation begins with dismissal. Ross sees only another young man with a pistol and a chip on his shoulder, another lost soul in a world that has no shortage of them. But then Jack speaks his name, speaks his father's name, and the past Ross thought buried rises up in front of him, armed and articulate. In the truest sense, this is the government's reckoning made flesh. The duel that follows is the living embodiment of every Western showdown, yet stripped of honor, stripped of law. Two men face each other in the mud and reeds, not for justice, but for a private verdict on a public betrayal. Jack stands where John once stood, revolver low, heart pounding, the dreams his parents had for him bring away under the weight of what must be done. Ross reaches for his gun, and the world narrows to a heartbeat, a breath, a trigger. When it ends, Ross lies dead by the river he hunted for sport, and Jack stands alone. He has avenged his father, but he has also crossed the final threshold into the life John and Abigail tried to keep from him. This is redemption of a kind, but what kind? Is this the end of the Linde story, or proof that from the very beginning it was never about escaping violence at all, only about passing it down, dressed in different words and better intentions? Jack's final shot closes one chapter, but it also forces the whole story into focus. From its humble beginnings with Dutch and Hosea dreaming of freedom, to a boy on a riverbank inheriting a cycle of blood, the Linde saga becomes more than an outlaw tale. It becomes the living embodiment of what the American West promised, and what it actually delivered. At the very beginning, Dutch's philosophy sounded almost noble. He spoke of freedom from government control, of resisting a civilization built on railroads, banks, and faceless men in suits. He promised protection for the poor and dispossessed, and a family chosen rather than assigned by birth or class. For people like Arthur, an abandoned teenager, or John, a half-feral boy from an orphanage, this was salvation in the truest sense. The gang's first robberies targeted wealthy businessmen, corrupt officials, railroad companies profiting from stolen land. Dutch could look a starving farmer in the eye and say, with some truth, that he was on the right side of history. But ideals are easy when the stakes are low. As the years passed, the gap between Dutch's words and the gang's actions widened, step by bloody step. They still spoke about robbing the rich, yet they burned towns, extorted small ranchers, and shook down struggling shopkeepers. They claimed to be a family, yet they abandoned Jenny, Kieran, and Trelawney, sacrificed Sean, Lenny, and Hosea to doomed plans, and finally turned on Arthur and John when loyalty threatened Dutch's pride. Freedom became an excuse. Philosophy became a shield. Underneath the speeches, they were exploiting the same poor souls they once claimed to protect. This descent mirrors the world closing in around them. The story unfolds at the exact moment the frontiers declared closed, when the map is filled in and the old ways were dying. Railroads stitch the continent together, telegraphs erase distance. Pinkertons and federal agents move wherever capital points a finger. Men who refuse the new rules do not simply ride further west. There is no further west to ride. Dutch's dream depends on empty land and absent law, but the world was changing faster than any gun could answer. In that sense, the Linde gang becomes a microcosm of America itself. A nation built on talk of freedom and equality, yet expanded through dispossession, exploitation, and carefully forgotten violence. Dutch preaches liberation while using people as tools. The government preaches order while using men like John as disposable weapons. Both claim to offer family, belonging, a place in the world. Both leave broken promises and unmarked graves behind. Here's the pattern interrupt. Imagine the gang not as heroes or villains, but as lost soul after lost soul, trying and failing to carve out space in a world that was never going to make room for them. What if Dutch's tragedy is not that he was uniquely monstrous, but that his dreams and delusions were perfectly American? And if that is true, what does redemption even mean in a land built this way? If Dutch's dreams are a mirror held up to America, then Arthur, John, and Jack are its three failed prayers. A story of redemption and repetition, of freedom and civilization, of men trying to change when the world was already done with them. Arthur's path is the clearest and the cruelest. From its humble beginnings, his life is violence in service of another man's philosophy. Rob the rich, fight the government, keep the family together at any cost. By the time tuberculosis hollows him out, he is the living embodiment of the gang's contradictions, a loyal enforcer who can finally see the damage he has done. With death closing in, he chooses something radically small. He stops chasing Dutch's approval, stops chasing the final score, and turns toward one fragile thing he can still protect: John, Abigail, and Jack. On that last ride to rescue John from the Sisika Jobs fallout, on that desperate climb up the mountain as Pinkertons close in, Arthur spends his remaining strength not on gold, but on buying a future for a different family. In the truest sense, his redemption is not about erasing his crimes. It is about redirecting his loyalty. Yet even this is limited. Illness is eating him. The gang's momentum is dragging everything toward the cliff, and the world was changing faster than any one man's conscience. Arthur dies knowing he has saved a few lives, not the soul of the West. John takes that gift and tries to turn it into permanence. He walks away from the outlaw life, builds Beecher's Hope board by board, and submits to the state's authority, hunting down his old gang for federal agents who promise safety for Abigail and Jack. It is a grim irony, the former outlaw doing the government's dirty work, believing obedience will buy redemption. But civilization has its own code, and it is not mercy. When John has done everything asked of him, the agents do not free him. They surround his barn and cut him down. His dream of a quiet ranch is real enough to hurt, but not strong enough to survive a system that values control over any man's change of heart. Then there is Jack, the boy both men tried to save. Raised on stories of cowboys and outlaws, educated by books Arthur gives him, he seems destined for a different life. Yet when John dies, the old ways were dying too, and the only script the world offers Jack is revenge. Tracking down Edgar Ross years later, he avenges his father in a lonely duel by the river. Justice, perhaps, but the moment he pulls the trigger, he steps into the same cycle of violence that destroyed Arthur and John. Will he ever escape it, or has redemption skipped a generation entirely? Each man's attempt is fenced in by forces larger than himself. Arthur by disease and the gang's inertia, John by the state's need to make an example, Jack by a culture that tells him a real man answers blood with blood. Maybe that is the quiet thesis of Red Dead Redemption. Not that sin can be washed clean, but that small acts of love and resistance still matter in a world where the big forces always win. And to see how those forces finally close in, the story has to ride forward to the last days of the gang's survivors. The last days of the gang's survivors do not end when the gunsmoke clears. They linger in stories. In the truest sense, the Van der Linde gang becomes a legend long before the last of its members falls. In the towns and ranches of New Hanover and Lemoyne, their memory fractures into half-truth and hearsay. Old-timers in saloons talk about the night a train near Wallace Station was robbed by phantoms who vanished into the storm, swearing that one of them tipped his hat and apologized before stealing their wallets. Parents warn children about the Butcher of Valentine, spinning the drunken saloon brawl into a full massacre, while hunters around campfires repeat tales of an outlaw who rode into the mountains to die on his feet rather than crawl to civilization. That becomes Arthur's last ride, stripped of names, polished into a story of freedom and defiance. Dutch's speeches, once delivered to a ragged family around a campfire, are remembered as wild sermons. Some recall an idealistic rebel railing against government and railroads, others only a madman shouting about betrayal and destiny as his gang tore itself apart. Depending on who tells it, Dutch is the living embodiment of resistance or the patron saint of delusions. Official history, however, has no patience for nuance. Government reports reduce decades of dreams and failures to a list of incidents and casualties. Blackwater, Valentine, Rhodes, St. Denis, Beecher's Hope. Each robbery is framed as an attack on order, each dead Pinkerton as a martyr for progress. Newspapers seize on the spectacle, printing lurid headlines about butchers, savages, and the last outlaw king, turning Dutch and his men into convenient villains so that men like Edgar Ross can be cast as heroes. In those accounts, Ross is not a petty bureaucrat hiding behind a badge, but a brave agent who tamed the last wild corner of the world. Yet beneath those competing versions lies a quieter pull. This is a story of freedom and family, of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams that cannot survive contact with power. The von der Linde saga offers the fantasy of riding where the map runs out, of finding a place among outcasts when the old ways were dying. Then it forces a reckoning. What is the cost of that freedom when it is built on blood, on hostage trains, and burned plantations and broken children? The games themselves understand this tension and lean into myth even as they dismantle it. Cinematic duels frame outlaws in perfect silhouette. Slow motion last stands turn doomed shootouts into operatic farewells, and riders are set against sunsets so vast they feel eternal. Yet the writing never lets the illusion stand for long. Beneath every iconic vista is a coughing man with tuberculosis, a frightened woman with nowhere to go, a boy staring at a future he never asked for. Here the pattern twists, because this legend is not only something told by survivors and newspapers. By stepping into Arthur's boots and guiding John's weary ride toward Beecher's hope, the audience has already become part of the retelling, reshaping this myth every time the trigger is pulled or a horse is turned toward home. That is why this legend cuts so deep. Beneath the shootouts and the train robberies, this is a story of people who build a home in a hostile world, only to watch the foundation crack under the weight of pride and fear. From the very beginning, the van der Linde gang is more than a crew of outlaws. It is a refuge for the abandoned and the abused, a makeshift hearth for anyone civilization has decided does not belong. Arthur is taken in after losing both parents, a teenage thief turned into a son by Dutch's attention and Hosea's quiet patience. John arrives from an orphanage and an abusive upbringing, beaten and discarded until Dutch offers him something he has never had before, a name spoken with approval, a place at the fire, a future that feels chosen rather than imposed. That promise of unconditional acceptance is the living embodiment of found family. Around the camp, titles blur. Susan is not just an enforcer. She is the one who makes sure everyone eats. Uncle is a lazy drunk, but also the uncle who never leaves. Abigail, once treated as little more than a camp follower, becomes the center of a small, fragile household. For players guiding Arthur's horse through camp, this world of chores, songs, and idle conversation becomes familiar, almost domestic. Coffee is poured, cards are dealt, someone starts humming a hymn, and for a moment the gun belts and wanted posters feel far away. The games lean into this rhythm. They slow down. They ask, what does freedom mean when it is shared around a cooking pot? When it is expressed through helping Pearson skin a deer or joining in a rough, off-key chorus? These small interactions turn NPCs into people, and people into responsibilities. When Sean jokes, when Lenny dreams about the future, when Jack plays with his toy horse, the camp stops being a backdrop and becomes a home that must be protected. That is why Dutch's unraveling lands with such force. His betrayal is not a single moment, it is a long, painful erosion of trust. The man who once preached a rough, idealistic philosophy of protecting the weak begins to sacrifice those very people to his own paranoia. Hosea's death is not just a tactical loss, it is a father ripped away while the other father stands frozen. When Dutch abandons Arthur on the trolley in St. Denis, or leaves John for dead at the oil fields, it feels less like a leader making hard choices and more like a parent breaking faith with his children. In the truest sense, the tragedy is universal. Who has not outgrown the people who raised them? Who has not realized that a hero's grand speeches can hide selfishness and delusions? Arthur's arc becomes the painful process of deciding which parts of Dutch's philosophy to carry forward, loyalty, compassion for the downtrodden, and which to bury with the old ways that are dying. John's journey, from reluctant enforcer to husband and father at Beecher's Hope, is that same choice made in quieter, more domestic terms. By the time the gang's camps are gone and only lonely homesteads remain, the saga reveals itself not just as a western about outlaws versus civilization, but as a story of growing up and letting go. To understand that emotional core is to see why the ending cannot simply be one last gunfight. It has to be a reckoning. And that reckoning does not end with Arthur or John. It passes on to Jack, to the new century, to every retelling of this myth. The question is no longer just who dies, but what survives of this broken family's dreams. That reckoning begins long before Arthur's last ride, at the very beginning, with two men on a dusty road trying to rob each other and ending up in hysterical laughter. Dutch von der Linde and Hosea Matthews fail to pull their cons, trade stories instead of bullets, and in that moment invent a new kind of outlaw family. From its humble beginnings, the gang is a story of shared hunger, shared wit, and shared dreams of freedom. They preach a philosophy as much as they plan robberies. Dutch rails against civilization, against governments and railroads and bankers, promising a world where the poor and the lost can live free. Hosea tempers him with caution and pragmatism. When they take in Arthur Morgan as a teenager, A lost soul with a dead father and no future, they do not simply gain a gun, they gain a son. Later, when John Marston arrives, half wild and angry, he becomes another. In the truest sense, Dutch and Hosea build a family before they build a fortune. For a time, that dream almost works. The early heists hit the rich and the corrupt, trains and stagecoaches that symbolize the new order closing in. Camps at places like Horseshoe Overlook feel golden. Evenings by the fire, children laughing, plans for one last score that will buy real freedom. Arthur rides as Dutch's right hand, John grows into a father to Jack, and the gang becomes the living embodiment of their shared belief that the world can be taken on their own terms. Then the cracks widen. The unseen ferry disaster at Blackwater shatters their invincibility, forcing a frozen exile in Coulter and a desperate flight through Rhodes, Clemens Point, Shady Bell, and finally the Rod of Beaver Hollow. Each move brings more hunger, more fear, more betrayal. The St. Denis bank job turns Dutch's grand philosophy into a street execution. Hosea dies as a decoy. Lenny falls on a rooftop and Dutch's mask of control slips. Micah Bell whispers poison in Dutch's ear, feeding his paranoia as Arthur's illness forces him to see the gang's delusions clearly. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Dutch refuses to admit it. On the mountain above Beaver Hollow, with Pinkertons closing in and the family in ruins, Arthur confronts Micah, begs Dutch to remember who he was. Dutch walks away from both of them, abandoning his sons and his own ideals. Years later, John tries to do what Dutch never could, leave. He builds Beecher's Hope, works the land, teaches Jack to read instead of shoot. But the state will not let the past rest. Government agents drag him back into the hunt, forcing him to track down Bill in Mexico, Javier in the mountains, and finally Dutch, broken and raving on a cliff. Dutch steps off the edge, and John returns home only to die in a hail of government bullets at his own barn. Jack Marston grows up in that shadow. When he hunts down Edgar Ross on a dusty riverbank and kills him, the chain that began with Dutch and Hosea's first idealistic crimes comes full circle. The boy raised on stories of freedom chooses revenge instead. What future can grow from that? The saga does not end. It echoes, reshaping the new century with the ghosts of an outlaw family that could not escape its own story. That echo is the point. Red Dead Redemption is not just a story of one doomed gang, but of a country teaching itself who the heroes are supposed to be. Outlaws and agents, ranchers and rail barons, all caught in the same performance, pretending that violence in the name of progress is somehow cleaner than any other kind. From its humble beginnings as a tale of a few thieves robbing the rich, the saga grows into a quiet dismantling of the Western myth. The good outlaw fantasy says men like Dutch and John are rough but noble, standing apart from a corrupt civilization. The civilizing government claims the opposite, insisting that men like Edgar Ross bring order to a savage world. The games strip both stories bare. Dutch's philosophy of freedom becomes an excuse for cruelty. The Bureau's language of duty becomes a mask for assassination and dispossession. The world was changing and the old ways were dying, but not by accident. The death of the Old West in these games mirrors the real machinery grinding behind the sunset. Indigenous nations pushed off their land, reservations imposed, cultures broken in the name of schools and churches. Corporate empires rise on oil fields and railroads, fencing off open range so that profit can be counted in ledgers instead of cattle brands. State power centralizes through Pinkertons, marshals, and federal agencies, announcing law and order while clearing anyone who stands in the way. Dutch stands on one side of that divide, the government on the other, yet their reflections keep lining up. Dutch says every robbery, every dead civilian is for the greater good of his family, of freedom, of some imagined future where no one bows to a king or president. Ross and his superiors say every betrayal, every coerced gunman is for the greater good of civilization, of safety, of a modern nation that cannot tolerate outlaws. Both speak in grand ideals. Both leave bodies in the dust. Caught between those mirrors are the ordinary lives. Arthur, wasting away from tuberculosis while trying to do one last decent thing. John, trading one master for another as he swaps Dutch's orders for Ross's threats. Jack, the living embodiment of a new century poisoned by an old feud. Their dreams of freedom, family, and honest work are constantly negotiated against the demands of men who claim to know what the world needs. Progress arrives on iron rails and telegraph wires. It brings cities, schools, factories, and the promise of opportunity. It also erases languages, crushes dissent, and turns whole communities into collateral damage. The games never deny the appeal of that progress. They simply insist on showing the blood price paid by those trampled under it, from the wapiti to the nameless laborers buried along the tracks. So, what does redemption mean in the truest sense? In a world where every choice is compromised? Is it a clean slate that no one in this story can truly earn? Or is it only the stubborn decision to keep reaching for something better in a land built on betrayal? Red Dead Redemption has always been a story of hard choices in a hard land, but its power does not end with the last shot or the final cutscene, the moment the controller is picked up, or this tale is heard from its humble beginnings to its bitter end. Another role is claimed in the saga: witness, archivist, storyteller. As long as someone remembers Arthur on that ridge, John at that barn, and Jack by that riverside, their world does not fall completely silent. From the very beginning, the von der Linde gang promised freedom and family to those the world had already written off. Now the story passes into the hands of those who follow it, not as distant observers, but as the next link in a long chain of remembering. Every ride with Arthur, every weary step with John, every quiet moment with Jack turns a scripted tale into a living embodiment of the old ways that were dying and the new order pressing in. Different hearts will gravitate toward different figures. Some will feel closest to Arthur, the loyal outlaw trying to carve out a last act that means something, trying to shift a life of violence toward a final gesture of mercy or defiance. Others will see themselves in John, stumbling through the ruins of bad decisions, trying to build a ranch, a marriage, a future that does not have a price on its head. And some will recognize Jack, caught between books and bullets, education and bloodline, wondering whether destiny is inherited or chosen. Which path feels most familiar? Which fear, which hope, which compromise lingers the longest? With the full, connected timeline in mind, the entire saga sharpens. A stray line at Horseshoe Overlook, a half-heard argument in camp, a scribbled journal entry about a cough or a doubt suddenly carries the weight of what is coming. Dutch praising loyalty in 1899 echoes bitterly against his betrayal on the cliffs years later. Jack asking about his father's past in Beecher's Hope foreshadows the day he stands over Edgar Ross with a gun, answering questions in the only language civilization ever seemed to respect. The von der Linde gang is not only a parade of doomed outlaws, it is a mirror. Every viewer carries memories of their own gangs and families, the ideals taught as unshakable truth, the quiet betrayals that broke that faith, the private decisions about what to keep and what to finally lay down. In that tension between inheritance and choice, between dreams and delusions, this becomes more than a Western. It becomes, in the truest sense, a story of how people decide who they are going to be when the world is changing faster than they can follow. Reaching this point means standing among a small circle that now sees the entire van der Linde saga as one continuous arc, from campfire jokes to graves on lonely hillsides. And this is not the only tale etched into the fading edges of the frontier. There are more stories of broken philosophies, fragile families, and the slow death of an era waiting just beyond the horizon. Those stories do not end with the credits. They linger, the way a campfire's last embers glow long after the flames have died. This has been more than a recap of events and missions. It has been a story of family and philosophy, of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams that reached for freedom and collapsed under the weight of reality. From its humble beginnings, with two conmen testing each other's pockets, to a ranch buried in snow and a boy standing alone with a revolver, this saga carries an emotional weight that does not fade easily. It is, in the truest sense, a tragic family chronicle stretched across decades. Dutch and Hosea building a world in their own image, Arthur clawing toward redemption as his body fails, John trying to carve out a quiet life, and Jack inheriting a curse he never chose. Every viewer carries a different wound out of this journey. For some, it is Arthur gasping on that mountaintop, watching the sun rise over a world he will never fully escape. For others, it is John stepping out of that barn, or Jack walking away from Edgar Ross's body with nothing left but silence. Which moment broke the heart the most? Which character felt like the living embodiment of this doomed era? The comment section becomes another campfire, where each lost soul can lay down their memories of these outlaws and the civilization that crushed them. Perspectives change with time and distance. Dutch's early charm can seem almost heroic until the pattern of delusions and sacrifices becomes impossible to ignore. Arthur, once dismissed as a blunt instrument, reveals himself as the conscience of the gang. John shifts from reluctant partner in RDR2 to tragic protagonist in the first game, and Jack transforms from frightened child to the final echo of a dying West. How has the view of Dutch's philosophy changed now? Whose fall feels most tragic when the entire timeline is laid bare? Seen as one continuous arc, familiar scenes gain a new sharpness. The Saint-Denis streets are no longer just a backdrop for a bank job. They are the place where Hosea's death seals Dutch's fate. The quiet moments on Beecher's Hope are no longer simple epilogue, but the fragile reward Arthur and Abigail bled for. Replaying these missions with the full story in mind turns old shootouts into funerals and small conversations into final goodbyes. Beyond this tale, other paths wait. There are deep dives into Dutch's early robberies and the first meeting with Hosea, explorations of Sadie Adler's journey from grieving widow to relentless gunfighter, and examinations of the historical world closing in as the old ways were dying. Each one is another angle on this same collapsing frontier, another way to understand how freedom, family, and violence intertwined. For those who wish to keep riding alongside others who care about these stories of the West, there is a simple path forward. Leaving a like, subscribing, and turning on notifications is less a plea to an invisible algorithm and more an invitation to stay with a community that remembers these characters, revisits their choices, and continues to trace the long shadow of the Van der Linde gang across a changing world.